Hey guys, this is Justin. Hello and welcome to another special compilation video. I'm still on break, so I put these videos together to tide you guys over. Today, I'll be giving you guys a ton of Star Wars spaceship lore, and I've tried to select videos which weren't as popular or which I think some of you haven't seen. I've also went out of my way to not pick any videos from the last 6 months or so, and I've cropped out any sponsorships, intros, and outros for what is hopefully a pleasant viewing experience. I'll be back in a day or two, so expect uploads to resume soon. Until then, sit back, do some work, play some video games, go to sleep, whatever. Just enjoy the video.
The X-Wing was an amazing vessel, but the one that followed it, in my opinion, was far superior. Today we'll be doing a full breakdown of the E-Wing, one of the New Republic's greatest fighters. Because I love this ship so much, I actually commissioned a beautiful new E-Wing model, which you guys can see right now. And as a note, the general design from this is actually based on a model created by my friend Multi-H, and I'll link to his Twitter down below. As you can see though, the E-Wing is a very different fighter. It lacks the apparent complexity of something like an X-Wing or a B-Wing and has no moving S-foil. Instead, we have a ship that looks somewhat rugged, dependable, and that actually basically sums up the E-Wing fairly well. So the E-Wing first appeared in the Dark Empire comics, and ever since its first real lore dump in the Dark Empire sourcebook, most of the fighter's details have actually remained pretty consistent. So the E-Wing was the first fighter commissioned, designed, and created by the New Republic. For most of the New Republic's early years fighting warlords, they were still using their old favorites, the X-Wings and Y-Wings that the Rebellion had been gifted and had produced. But the E-Wing, alongside the MC-90, which was the first New Republic purpose-built warship, was, in my opinion, a major step forward. It was really a combination of the best features of the A-Wing and the X-Wing, with even a little bit of Y-Wing sprinkled in there. In the Thrawn trilogy, there's one scene where Grand Admiral Thrawn is attacking a convoy which is protected by A-Wings. A-Wings, as it turns out, are poorly situated for convoy duty. They're purpose-built for speed, and when they're protecting slow-moving spaceships, they lose that one advantage. This is important because when the E-Wing was being designed, the New Republic was suffering attacks against their shipping lanes or their transportation vessels. Imperial warlords were attacking them either to steal supplies or just to disrupt New Republic operations. This is, of course, somewhat ironic because that was the main strategy of the Alliance during the earlier years of the Galactic Civil War. But anyway, the new Essential Guide to Vehicles and Vessels explains that the E-Wing, which was designed by the same engineers who created the X-Wing, were in many ways an improvement over the state-of-the-art A-Wing. It wasn't as fast as the A-Wing, but it could still keep pace with the TIE Interceptors and was far better armored than other New Republic starfighters, including the X-Wing. So it still has a lot of the A-Wing speed, not quite as much and probably not as much maneuverability, but it gained more armor. So it didn't have to make the same sacrifice as the A-Wing, if that makes sense. So it's much more well situated for working as a multi-role starfighter. Alongside that really impressive durability and speed was an amazing suite of weapons. The E-Wing had a trio of laser cannons, including of course the distinctive laser cannon on the top of the cockpit, but according to the new Essential Guide to Vehicles and Vessels, it also carried the second most firepower at the time of its design, behind only the B-Wing itself. Now of course, as the New Republic made more advanced heavy bomber fighters, like the K-Wing for example, the E-Wing would have fallen down in the ranks quite a bit, but it's impressive because the E-Wing is not meant to be a big capital ship fighting starfighter. Nonetheless, with 16 proton torpedoes, it could function as a light or even medium bomber. It does seem like the E-Wing made some sacrifices in order to achieve this godly combination of speed, durability, and firepower. For one, as I mentioned, it went with the sort of Y-Wing design, i.e. there weren't a lot of movable parts. It was a very simple starfighter. Not necessarily a bad thing, just something to note. Second, the cannons were designed to use a synthetic Tabana gas. This is, according to the Dark Empire sourcebook, because of, and I quote, the state of the galactic economy, with synthetic seeming like an economical alternative to natural Tabana gas. However, synthetic Tabana proved to be somewhat unreliable, and again, according to the Dark Empire sourcebook, as the gas's spiral structure broke down, the weapon range of the E-Wing 2 would also decrease. So the vessel becomes less effective the longer it's using this synthetic gas. So there were two options. One was to replace the gas on a regular basis, which kind of removed the economical argument for using it in the first place, but later a mechanical solution was created, leading to the Type B E-Wing. There's also the fact that a lot of the E-Wing's systems were pushed off to the astromech droid. Interestingly, because of the advanced nature of the craft, the E-Wing did not ordinarily use an R2 astromech, rather it had an R7 droid, which is actually hidden within the vessel itself, which kind of makes sense. There's no reason to have your droid exposed as long as it can reach important areas for maintenance. But I mean, that's still somewhat of a problem. You've got a vessel which is supposed to be cheaper to run and just all around really phenomenal, but now you need a specialized astromech. So there were at least 4 series of E-Wings, with the last series at least being backward compatible with R2 units. Aside from most likely fixing the issue with the Tabana gas, there's not a whole lot of detail regarding other improvements made to the E-Wing, which I mean makes sense. The vessel itself was really phenomenal. As I mentioned, it had better armor than the X-Wing, it could almost match the A-Wing in speed, and it had a crap load of firepower. So really the only improvements you'd need would be incremental technology increases to sort of keep up with contemporary fighters. And we do see that the E-Wing has a fairly long life, especially when it doesn't have the same fan recognition. Of course, it was first introduced in Dark Empire, but throughout Star Wars Legends, often if you see a Jedi taking their personal starfighter, for example, it will be an E-Wing, or if a New Republic vessel is launching fighters, they'll be E-Wings. I just read The Black Fleet Crisis as a part of TapCaf Transmissions, my Star Wars podcast I run, and even the 5th Fleet, which is supposed to have all state-of-the-art new vessels about 10 years almost after the launch of the E-Wing, was still using E-Wings to protect their K-Wings. It is true, however, that more of the advanced X-Wings did see some use. The Jedi, for example, would typically move to their XJ fighters. There were other highly advanced X-Wings regularly within use in the New Republic and Galactic Alliance's Navy. But even Rogue Squadron, probably the most famous X-Wing group in galactic history, sometimes used E-Wings, which is pretty impressive. All in all, though, I think it's an amazing ship. I love the design. It just screams Star Wars to me. It manages to be close enough to something like the Z95 or of course the X-Wing to feel like it's in universe. It's got that sensor array on the nose, very X-Wing like, but it's still different enough that it's a unique ship and has a very nice look to it. One thing that people always talk about is, well, what about that blaster cannon over the cockpit? And yeah, that is an issue. For one, the blaster firing could definitely blind the cockpit, although I'm sure there's some way you could create some sort of screen to protect the pilot from that. But also, you gotta be careful that you don't bump your head when you're exiting the E-Wing. A lot of people have asked me, how do pilots get out? And I assume that the canopy either slides forward or maybe to one side, then you just have to watch your head. Also, when making the model, we did decide to add thrusters to the back. This is actually something that I requested specifically. Not necessarily something you usually see in the lore, but I thought it would be a cool addition. And I mean, it looks a bit weird to me with just a blank spot right on the tail end. I thought an extra engine would look cool.
So I thought it'd be fun to look at the New Republic's history of ganking Star Destroyers from the Empire, because in both canon and Legends, after Endor specifically, the Empire lost several SSDs and other dreadnoughts to the New Republic. Legends specifically sees some of them actually thrown back into use, so we'll talk about all of that today. Before we get to Legends though, let's do a brief breakdown of canon, because things are very, very simple. All of the information we have regarding the Empire's post-Endor Super Star Destroyers actually comes from the Aftermath series. In those books, there's a lot of attention paid to the Empire's fleet numbers, and we learn in Life Debt that the New Republic actually has their hands on, at that point at least, 3 Super Star Destroyers, 2 which were willingly surrendered by their Imperial captains, and the 3rd being captured over Kuat as it was undergoing repairs. The New Republic was actually incredibly productive during this time period, because aside from the 3 captured Super Star Destroyers, they
did manage to destroy 5 others, which is very, very impressive. There's also another ship, the Annihilator, which was not captured by the Alliance, but rather by pirates, and was renamed the Liberty's Misrule. So despite these ships being captured, on the Rebel side, we don't really learn about how they were used by the New Republic. Presumably, at some point, they had enough staff to at least man them, but it's also possible that they were decommissioned, used for mobile or immobile bases, perhaps taken apart for other ships like the Starhawk project. Who knows? I mean, perhaps there is some sort of reason why, as the New Republic, you wouldn't want to use one of the Empire's most powerful and terrifying tools as you're trying to win the hearts and mind of the galaxy. Alright, so that's canon. As I said, pretty short. Let's now turn to Star Wars Legends, where the New Republic has not only captured several dreadnought-sized ships, but actually produced several of their own, most notably the Viscount line. Now, the Viscount isn't a Super Star Destroyer per se, but it is a Super Star Destroyer analog. The Bounty and Krikana and perhaps other Viscount Star Dreadnoughts were 19 kilometers long, and were among the deadliest ships in Star Wars history. There were also other Star Defenders and very large ships created by the New Republic, although we know next to nothing about them. One example would be the Strident class Star Defender. Then, during the Second Galactic Civil War, Corellia also made their own dreadnought, though we know very, very few details about that ship. Let's instead, though, focus on Super Star Destroyers specifically, because there were quite a few notable ships used by the New Republic, the foremost of which was the Lusankya. Lusankya was the sister ship to the Executor, the original SSD. The name Lusankya for a long time drew fear into the hearts of New Republic soldiers because it was known as one of the Empire's most severe prisons and reconditioning centers. People would go to the Lusankya and they would come back as brainwashed Imperial sleeper agents. In the X-Wing series, after the New Republic has taken Coruscant from the Empire, it's revealed that the Lusankya is actually an Executor-class Super Star Destroyer. How is it revealed? Well, the Lusankya bursts through the planet's surface, pounds its way through the planetary shield, and jumps off to hyperspace, ferrying Izani Isard. However, by the end of the Back to War, the New Republic would capture the Lusankya, and it would formally enter service. The Lusankya would just sit for a while, but in 12 ABY would return to active military service as a part of the New Republic's Orinda campaign against the Imperial Remnants. However, the ship would play an even more important role during the Yuuzhan Vong War, as it was one of the main assets used aggressively against the Vong, and at the Battle of Borlias, Lucy was used to ram and thus destroy a Yuuzhan Vong world ship as a part of Operation Emperor's Spear. Another captured New Republic Super Star Destroyer was the Guardian. The Guardian, which was heavily damaged shortly after the Battle of Endor, spent a lot of time in repair before eventually being surrendered to the New Republic. The New Republic immediately refitted the Guardian and added it to its fleets, where it would serve under the command of Admiral Akbar during the very late stages of the Galactic Civil War, shortly before the signing of the Pelion-Gaversam Treaty. The Pelion-Gaversam Treaty actually officially ended hostilities between the New Republic and the Empire, and despite some early difficulties, they would be driven even closer together by the Yuuzhan Vong War. By the Second Galactic Civil War, in fact, the New Republic had transitioned into the Galactic Alliance, which was made up of not only the New Republic, but also the largest Imperial Remnant faction, just the Imperial Remnant at that point. So we actually see Super Star Destroyers make their way into New Republic, well, technically GA service, without having been captured. The best example of this would be the Megador. The Megador and another Super Star Destroyer, the Dominion, which we'll discuss in just a second, were both discovered in the deep core shipyards of the Galactic Empire. During the Swarm War, Imperial Supreme Commander Gilad Pelion was pushed into service on behalf of the Galactic Alliance, and he brought the Megador as his flagship. We don't know exactly what type of Star Destroyer the Megador was, or what type of Super Star Destroyer that is, but by all accounts it does seem fairly similar to a standard Executor. Later, the Megador would fall under the command of Jason Solo, or Darth Kaitis, as he participated in the Second Galactic Civil War. So I mentioned alongside the Megador, the Empire also found the Dominion. We don't know much of that ship's history other than the fact that it participated in some of those late Imperial campaigns that the Guardian fought in, and like the Megador was ultimately unsuccessful there, and that it remained in the command of the Imperial Remnant, including the Remnant when it was being manipulated and controlled by Jason Solo. It's very possible that the Dominion could have been used as well during the Yuuzhan Vong War under a joint GA task force, course, it was probably at some major battles there, and although not technically a New Republic Super Star Destroyer, because of how the GA was structured, it can almost be considered one, just like the Megador. And there are probably other Super Star Destroyers that could fall under this designation. I doubt the Imperial Remnant was down to 2. They may have even built more after they were settled and at peace with the New Republic, but these are certainly the 2 we know about the most, but they're not nearly as famous as the Guardian and, in particular, the Lusankya.
And today we'll be talking about the ARC 170 and why it ultimately fell out of popular use in the Star Wars galaxy. The ARC 170, or the Regressive Reconnaissance 170, was of course a Republic starfighter made famous during the Clone Wars. It was an Incom product, and unsurprisingly, based on the wings, it was, according to the Revenge of the Sith cross-section, a cousin to the Z-95 and thus a predecessor to the galaxy's most famous and perhaps effective starfighter, the X-Wing. The ARC 170 was armed to the teeth. It had 2 very powerful forward-facing blaster cannons, which the cross-section also notes were much more powerful than the typical ship-based laser cannons of that era. It also had a proton torpedo launcher and, quite interestingly, a pair of manned rear-facing laser cannons. These guns, alongside the ship's powerful shields, helped increase survivability, especially where the thing was larger and slower than 95% of other starfighters on the battlefield at this point. The ARC 170 was a fairly complex craft to fly. It required not only a pilot, but also a co-pilot and a gunner who managed the rear-facing cannons. I guess that suggests that the cannons were probably fire-linked, but I wouldn't doubt that the gunner could also take control of each one individually. It just wouldn't be very practical in the heat of battle unless we're talking about a Jedi. The ARC 170 did also use an astromech droid alongside a hyperdrive, which we'll come back to in just a second. You likely won't be surprised to hear that because of the ship's heavy armament and effective shielding, it was usually used as a heavy assault fighter, useful for attacking capital ships with its torpedoes and laser cannons, but also fending off other starfighters, probably a bit more mobile than something like a Y-Wing. What you may not know, but you probably should if you think about the name, is that the ARC 170, the Aggressive Reconnaissance 170, was very frequently utilized for long-range missions. The ship could carry several days' worth of supplies. It had advanced sensors built into its nose, not unlike the X-Wing, so it would often be relied upon in a scouting role, or in cases when a ship would attack maybe behind enemy lines, away from reinforcements, wherever. This is something that the Rebel Alliance would do with ships like the Y-Wing. Basically, if you can't support your starfighters with a capital ship, you get in there, do as much damage as possible, try to survive, and hyperspace jump away. Arguably, because of the Clone Wars nature, these hit and fade attacks were a little less successful, but that was definitely some of the action that the ARC 170 would have seen alongside more traditional battles like we see with Coruscant. That's a lot of the good. Let's talk about the bad, and I covered one of the major things already. The ARC 170 was slow and unwieldy. Both the Clone Wars and the Galactic Civil War saw fast starfighters like the TIE Interceptor and the A-Wing dominate in dogfights, so these things were definitely a bit of a sitting duck, not unlike again the Y-Wing or especially the TIE Bomber. One other issue though with the ARC 170 is the cost in both replacement technology and, more importantly, personnel. The ARC 170 needed 3 pilots and an astromech droid. If you lose your ship, you are losing a lot in terms of personnel, everything that comes with them, training, equipment, and more. And the Saga Edition Starship of the Galaxy guide also notes specifically that these ships, even when they managed to survive, were very resource intensive and required a lot of repairs and regular maintenance. So why did the ARC 170 fail? And I would call the ship a failure. It did do some things effectively, but the Saga Edition notes that it didn't see wide production numbers even during the Clone Wars, at least compared to other Republic-era fighters, and the Empire chose to drop the ship when the new era was founded in favor of other vessels. When it comes to the Clone Wars, I think the Republic frankly just preferred other designs, sometimes using 2 starfighters of different class to make up for what the ARC 170 could offer. For example, although the ARC 170 is somewhat unique in the Republic's Navy as a heavy assault fighter, the Y-Wing does a lot that the ARC 170 does, while also being less expensive and less crew intensive. The Y-Wing carries more ordnance, it's also slow with a decent shield, and even has the gunner. The downside is that the Y-Wing was less of a dogfighter, but the Republic didn't really field the Y-Wing alone. It was usually protected by one of their many interceptor types, which they did make in numbers. So essentially, instead of having one ship that's pretty good at bombing and okay at dogfighting, they've got dedicated bombers and dedicated interceptors, and that seemed to work well for them. Seems like Republic's starfighter manufacturing was also pretty heavily standardized, so it's not like the Alliance where they'd be conducting hit and run attacks and using whatever they had. It just seems that the Republic chose the effectiveness of the two ships combined versus the ARC 170. Again, it's not like these ships saw no production, but the Saga Edition Starship Guide specifically mentions that they were produced in much smaller numbers than the other ships. That takes us to the Imperial era, and there were a few things that led to the ARC 170's downfall in that time period. For one, the Empire moved generally to light carrier-based fighters. The ARC 170 was frequently carrier-based, but it also did have that hyperdrive. Very few Imperial vessels had a hyperdrive. Almost all of them were connected to a mothership, and the heavy long-range fighter simply didn't fit very well with an Imperial doctrine. That being said, there were Imperial variants of the ARC 170. They were just even less common than what we saw during the Clone Wars. The Empire also preferred light, cheap fighters, and again, the ARC 170 had a noted high personnel and maintenance cost, so it doesn't really fit in, especially where the Empire gets a lot of their firepower from their capital ships, with starfighters seeming somewhat like an afterthought. Even the Rebellion didn't use ARC 170s very frequently. For one, there was a better successor ship, the X-Wing. It's a little less heavy, a little less protected than the ARC 170, but it's very mobile. It's got those heavy proton torpedo launchers, which is really what you need when taking down capital ships anyway. And it was a much better dogfighter, especially where the Y-Wing and the B-Wing did still exist to inflict casualties on capital ships. Yeah, I see the X-Wing as being better for the Rebel Alliance than the ARC 170 in almost every aspect, not only practically when it comes to missions, but again, returning to the Saga Edition Starship of the Galaxy Guide, that explains that even though some of the ships were liberated and used by the Rebel Alliance, most were mothballed or scrapped simply because the Rebels lacked the flight crews and repair bays necessary to keep the older ships ready for combat. And that makes total sense. You're dedicating 3 pilots to one ship. Yes, you're gaining rear-facing gunners, but the Rebels often chose not to even man their Y-Wing gunners because of personnel issues. A co-pilot, it's just a lot. The Rebel Alliance also relied, again, on hit-and-run attacks, but they were also very fast about it. They got in, they got out. The ARC 170 just doesn't offer the same thing that the X-Wing does. Was the ship useless, though? No, definitely not. As I mentioned, I think it worked pretty well in its specific niche, and if creative, I think the Rebel Alliance probably could have found some interesting uses. The Republic did have scout variants of the Y-Wing, so I don't think the ARC 170 was really needed for that, but I do think hit and run attacks behind enemy lines should have been the bread and butter of this ship. High value targets where you can justify the 3 individuals plus an astromech droid needed for the ship, and where you want something that can stand on its own without having to dedicate more ships to protect it, whether because of manpower reasons or because of stealth. I think it's also a pretty interesting candidate for a planetary assault ship, and unsurprisingly, it does have a cousin, the PTB 625, very similar to the ARC but much larger, and an airspeeder with a bomb bay. I think the ARC could have been even better in this role because it can launch, go through hyperspace, attack targets on the ground, then leave. Maybe they should have made a variant where the proton torpedo launch bay was swapped out for a bomb bay, and I can see that being very useful. But in my opinion, that's why the ARC 170 was somewhat of a failure for a starfighter, despite itself. I mean, it's a cool design. I think it does a lot of things pretty interestingly, but ultimately it was overshadowed by other starfighters of its era and certainly after. We've got a classic episode today. We will be breaking down a ship from the Star Wars galaxy. So today we'll be talking about the Assertor class Dreadnought. This is a really interesting one. We've talked a few times now about fan creations within the Star Wars universe. In one video, we talked about various fanon ships, which I thought were pretty cool, and in various other ones, we've talked about the way that Star Wars, and especially Star Wars comics, have managed to steal Star Wars fan art. However, today's episode is different. We'll be talking about a ship, the Assertor, which originally was a fan design, but was actually canonized and properly canonized with credit through the Essential Guide to Warfare. The Assertor was one of the many amazing ships modeled by friend of the channel, Fractal Sponge. Now, I'll include a link to Fractal's page down in the description, including his general website, his Discord, and his renders of the Assertor. I highly recommend you guys check him out. Fractal Sponge is one of the greats within the community, and he often contributes to other projects as well, and he just generally is a really cool dude. Anyway, let's talk about Fractal's version of the Assertor, because there is a bit of a distinction between how Fractal originally envisioned the ship and how it would be brought into Star Wars Legends. And Fractal's version of the Assertor was much more powerful. Basically, he envisioned it as the most powerful super star destroyer in existence. I'm not sure if he ever gave an official length, but the Assertor was said to have better power generation, firepower, shield strength, and equipment than the Executor, of course, its other contemporary. I think he intended the Assertor to be a newer ship than the Executor, and he said that the Assertor would have had superior ancillary equipment and would have had a more robust hull and power grid than earlier dreadnoughts. He also puts power generation at perhaps 2 times that of the Executor, and says that in a battle, the Assertor would have decisive superiority over either the Executor or the Mandator, 2 other dreadnought classes. From an acceleration standpoint, the Assertor would have been less mobile than something like the Executor, but more so than the large Dark Empire era dreadnoughts and especially the Eclipse. On that note, a main feature of Fractal's Assertor is a super laser. Probably less powerful than something like the Eclipse or perhaps even the Sovereign, but still strong enough to destroy a space station or a capital ship. We can see the aperture there on the front of the ship. Now, the super laser was never explicitly brought into the continuity, however the aperture remained there, so either there's some other explanation for it, or the super laser was still meant to be a part of the ship. Fractal says that the super laser is almost like a refined and more practical version of what would have been on the Sovereign or the Eclipse, more focused on fighting enemy capital ships rather than overwhelming power, and because of that, the ship is more mobile and a bit more practical for other roles. The Assertor also has gravity well generators, giving it interdiction capabilities, and this is a feature that is really lacking on the Executor class and a really big benefit within any Imperial fleet. The generators are represented by small bubbles on the hull that you won't really notice unless you're looking for them. Otherwise, I would argue that the Assertor puts more weaponry on the actual hull than the Executor. The entire surface is basically clumps of very large turbo lasers, where the Executor seems to put a lot of its guns in the trench that runs around the ship. I think this does make the Assertor a little bit more practical. The ship also lacks the same cityscape that the Executor has, and which is sometimes portrayed as a major weakness, especially when facing off against Starfighters. So that, combined with, I think, a better protected bridge, really gives the Assertor some nice design points. So all in all, Fractal's Assertor is a very well-designed ship. It would have been stacked to the brim with various types of weapons, including turbo lasers, ion cannons, ordnance launchers, and more. It had, of course, that axial super laser, and it had more power generation, which would have helped shielding and firepower than the Executor, and perhaps any other Imperial dreadnought with the exception of the Eclipse. But it was very mobile, it was a very practical capital ship, and it would have been one of, if not the best dreadnoughts in the Star Wars galaxy in a pure combat role. So what happened when the ship was canonized? Well, it was scaled down a bit. The Assertor made its first Star Wars Legends appearance in the Essential Guide to Warfare. However, it's really just some images that Fractal Sponge made and a brief mentioning of a Assertor class named the Wrath. The best real source for lore was the Lead by Example RPG sourcebook. Now, these are, I guess, quasi-canon. Technically, they probably fell within the Legends continuity, but they're a lesser level of canon than most other things, especially this one, which came out after Legends was formally ended. Anyway, Age of Rebellion makes the Assertor a clear second to the Executor in terms of power. It does not give the ship a super laser, but does say that it has enough firepower to destroy an entire planet. The Assertor is described as a command vessel and powerful mobile weapons platform, designed with an eye towards conventional fleet operations and sector command duties. To this end, it is equipped with a number of sophisticated communication and sensor suites, and it features command and control systems that allow its commander a nearly unparalleled view of the battlefield. So I do think this idea of the Assertor being a kind of high-tech SSD properly used in a command role is in keeping with the spirit of Fractal's creation. I would say Fractal Sponge would disagree with most of the numbers, but that's not really surprising, especially where we don't know exactly when this ship fully entered Imperial service. It seems like before the Battle of Yavin, which would actually put it before the Executor, so at 15 kilometers long, I guess it is sort of hard to justify it as a more powerful ship. Although length is really not how you should be measuring ship power. The Assertor is really large, we see a very large reactor bubble on the bottom, but ultimately that's what we're given. Lead by Example also confirms that there were at least 2 named Assertors, the Assertor itself and then of course the Wrath, with both ships currently deployed with large battle groups to provide support for anti-alliance operations along the border between the Outer Rim and Mid-Rim territories. I kind of see these fleets almost like mini death squadrons, although it continues to say that it can be assumed that the Assertor and the Wrath are traveling with dozens of other ships, including smaller dreadnoughts and Star Destroyers, and that might be a reference to the various fleets we see in the Essential Guide to Warfare. The Assertor is seen accompanied by Bellators and things like Praetors, basically other Fractal Sponge models, and I do like the idea of sort of roving fleets in the area between sort of civilization and the inner parts of the galaxy and the Outer Rim. The Assertor was technically recanonized or brought into Star Wars canon in the Starships and Speeders sourcebook for the FFG role-playing game. Now again, this is sort of a questionable level of canon, but we've also had references to non-Executor type Super Star Destroyers in the Aftermath trilogy, so I'm happy to accept this reference. But that's all I have to say about this, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you go check out Fractal Sponge. This video is basically made off of his creations, so it would be really nice if we go throw some support his way. Just be nice and say hello. Today's question is from Obsidian, basically asking about the 10,000 Star Destroyers I mentioned within the Zeistan fleet, and whether that meant that the Empire had less than 10,000 Star Destroyers at their height. I believe that the 25,000 number has been brought back into Star Wars canon, and if I remember correctly as well, the quote from the novelization doesn't say 10,000, it says tens of thousands, and I think it says most powerful fleet as well. Remember, the Zeistan had that super laser, so you can kind of sort of explain away any discrepancy that way. Even if it does use the word largest, you can just sort of substitute powerful in there as well. Things get tricky when it comes to novelizations, and I've found the new canon novelizations especially don't really focus a whole lot on the expanded universe, so there are sometimes lapses like this where there's some stuff that's put out that doesn't totally stick with the rest of the content. So, while most of you are probably very familiar with the famous Mon Cal Cruisers of the Star Wars galaxy, I bet that for a lot of you, your knowledge pretty much runs out when you get outside the movies. Of course, we see several Mon Cal Cruiser variants in the original trilogy, really 3 main variants as part of that Rebel fleet, and of course we've got further Mon Cal Cruisers in the sequel trilogy. None of these compare in pure power to the Mon Cal Cruisers that existed in Star Wars Legends, specifically the Mon Cal Cruisers created by the New Republic after the Battle of Endor. So I've covered a lot of these individually, but I thought today I'd give a brief overview of the New Republic's history in creating new ships. Alright, so let's paint the scene. You're the New Republic and you've just defeated the Empire at the Battle of Endor, and the galaxy is fracturing and splintering apart right in front of your eyes. You establish a new government, and now you've got to go in and fight the disparate parts of the Empire. What do? Well, first of all, you plan the creation of several new advanced capital ships, but before that can happen, you need a stand-in, and that's where we get the MC-80B. So I've covered this ship quite extensively in a past video, but the MC-80B was the New Republic's first attempt after Endor to make a powerful ship which could go toe-to-toe with Star Destroyers. Now, it wasn't a dramatic departure from existing Mon Calamari variants, hence it's an MC-80B, not a completely new generation, but still, this vessel had more armor, more firepower, and was just generally better suited for war than most ships available to the New Republic at that time, except for captured Imperial Star Destroyers. The most famous MC-80B was the Mon Ramonda, which was commanded for a time by Han Solo. This is still pretty early though. I wouldn't really count this as the late powerful Mon Calamari cruisers that this video will largely be focused about, and you could arguably say the same about the MC-90. So when you some footage from Thrawn's Revenge here, and I will do so throughout this video, but the MC-90 was the New Republic's really first mass-produced Mon Calamari cruiser built to full wartime specifications rather than being some sort of refit of a civilian vessel. The MC-90 is amazing. It's one of my favorite Mon Calamari ship designs. It is a bit more standardized than most Mon Calamari cruisers, which usually have an element of randomness and uniqueness to them, and that kind of reflects the changing role of the ship. The MC-90 is meant, again, as a sort of standardized Star Destroyer analog for the New Republic. They were being slotted into defense fleets and moved throughout the galaxy, and again, we're that usual combination of Mon Calamari shielding and firepower. Based on a lot of what I've read, it seems like the MC-90 was one of the most efficient and well-designed ships in the Galactic Civil War. But let's move on to something a little bit chunkier, and I want to talk about now the Mediator. So on screen, I'm showing you guys some footage again from Thrawn's Revenge. Now I will note, although this Mediator model is excellent, it's not an official model from Star Wars. It's not even an official design. It's based completely off artists working on the Thrawn Revenge team and their concept art. That being said, I quite like it, and I think it fits the idea of the Mediator quite well. First of all, we don't have any real size for the Mediator, but we know by the early New Jedi Order period that it was one of the New Republic's most powerful vessels. It's described as being extremely new and more powerfully armed and armored compared to the Mon Calamari cruisers which came before it. Leia describes it as having pacifying effects. It's at Osarion and Ramamul helping to broker a peace, with the name Mediator thus being pretty appropriate. The Mediator served throughout the Yuuzhan Vong War as the centerpiece for New Republic fleets, and as I said, I really like this fan depiction from Thrawn's Revenge because I think it's a pretty reasonable look at what this type of ship might have looked like. It outpowers cruisers and most reasonably sized ships. It's the center of many battle fleets, but it's certainly not a dreadnought. It's not a dreadnought, that is, unlike the Viscount. The Viscount class is interesting because although it actually gets a lot of attention in secondary material, it's not actually very present in Star Wars books. I mean, the Viscount is mentioned a few times during the New Jedi Order, but that's pretty much it, and any other mentions are typically in the abstract. Turning into Thrawn's Revenge, the first Viscount class was a prototype and much smaller than the later full dreadnought-sized version, but still, even this ship alone would have been quite powerful. Again, we're getting the general idea of taking the good things of Mon Calamari capital ships, the shielding, the intelligently designed hull, the advanced sensor and computer systems, the weaponry, and just scaling it up. The Viscount, however, unlike other ships, is not only long, but also massive. The full-sized Viscount, which comes in at 17 kilometers long, is not as long as an Executor-class Super Star Destroyer, but is a lot heavier and certainly a lot more powerful. We've talked about this in the past, but the Viscount was designed as a general response to Imperial Super Star Destroyers. So just imagine something like an Executor class, but with everything, again, that a Mon Calamari cruiser typically has to its advantage. Other than the Eclipse, I think the Viscount is probably the most singularly powerful ship which operated in the post-Endor era. The Viscount was a part of the Star Defender class, and there may have been other Star Defenders of other classifications built on planets like Corellia and Mon Calamari, but we really don't know. Still, I like to think of the Mediator, the prototype Viscount, the full Viscount, and this next ship as representing a pretty interesting time in Mon Calamari cruiser design, where large is good, powerful is good. The ships take the bluntness of Imperial battle cruisers and Star Destroyers, but add the elegance of Mon Calamari shielding and design. The last ship that I would call a part of this generation is the Mon Calamari Heavy Carrier, and unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot about this ship class. Again, I'm putting another representation up from Thrawn's Revenge here, but the Blue Diver is described in Legacy of the Force as seeming to be a pretty powerful vessel, and I think that there's probably other heavy Mon Calamari variants at this point as well. I'm sure there's a Mon Calamari heavy cruiser used by the GA because it seemed like they were militarizing. The Galactic Alliance also had several other powerful vessel types, including the Galactic class Battle Carrier, another ship that unfortunately we don't know a whole lot about, despite it having a very cool name. Also used the Megador, a Super Star Destroyer, what you could almost call a new generation of Imperial Star Destroyers, ISDs which had been refitted with more powerful weapons and internal interdiction systems, and I really wish we would have gotten gotten more of this era. There was even apparently going to be an insert into the Essential Guide to Warfare about the battle carriers and the heavy carriers, including the Mediator and the Blue Diver used by the New Republic. In fact, I've even seen some images that were going to be included, which unfortunately I don't think I can share. But after this era, it seems like things trended to the smaller. Mon Cal Cruisers took a drastic change by the time of the Legacy comic era, with the MC-140 being the current generation of Mon Cal Cruisers, a ship which definitely didn't have the same weight or design of the Mediator, Viscount, or more. So definitely a unique little era in New Republic / Galactic Alliance history. I hope you guys enjoyed this exploration of it. Today's video is a bit of a shorter one, and we will be looking at the Tector class Star Destroyer, which was a ship that first appeared sort of in Star Wars Episode 6. So a couple of days ago I made a post asking why Star Wars ships don't generally fly upside down. And of course, upside down is sort of imaginary when we're talking about fighting in a vacuum, but I think most of you probably get what I mean. Star Wars ships are always sort of oriented in the same general direction. In that video, I sort of talked about the Tector class Star Destroyer, which was kind of retconned to appear in Return of the Jedi. So let me explain the sort of backstory here, what the Tector is, the lore that's popped up to explain the ship after the film, and everything else. So if we look at the Battle of Endor, the scene in question featuring the Tector Star Destroyer comes right after the Rebel fleet engages the Star Destroyers at close range to try to avoid the firepower of the Death Star. We see the Millennium Falcon fly over what appears to be the body of a Star Destroyer in a pretty long shot. And if you're not really paying attention, you won't really notice anything here. However, especially if you know what a Star Destroyer looks like, you will notice a couple of things, and especially the fact that this supposed Star Destroyer doesn't have the typical terraces. The Falcon flies across its surface and it's almost completely flat. So from a filmmaking perspective, this is a bit of a weird scene, because why would they just have some random model lying around that's not an Imperial Star Destroyer, which they would use to fly over? Practically, it may have been because the scene looked really good with the Falcon flying in a straight line and the sort of vast background, but it's still really odd. I mean, how new is this model? Is this an adapted Star Destroyer? What's going on? Well, the interesting thing is, if you look at the Tector here, there are a lot of little details that match the underside of a traditional Imperial Star Destroyer, but there are also some really weird exclusions. So we do have that little negative space right in front of the hangar. I don't even know what that's called. Maybe it's where the tractor beam projectors are or something. It's almost like the space between two opened plates, I guess. But there are some differences as well. Even in this particular part, it does look like there's maybe more armor covering the negative space. However, that difference is pretty minor compared to what comes next. This ship doesn't have the large main hangar, which, as we see in even A New Hope, should be right after this point, and it's also missing the ventral bulb, the large protrusion on the bottom of the ship. What happened probably is that ILM took this Imperial 1 or 2 Star Destroyer base, changed it slightly, sort of kit bashing it, put stuff over the hangar, removed the reactor bulb, and there was a nice sort of scene for the Falcon to fly over. And while that may have been it from a filmmaking perspective, there's definitely a lot more going on behind the scenes that has been really fleshed out by authors and the expanded universe lore. So taking in mind the similarities of this ship to the underside of the ISD, the explanation created was that the Falcon was flying over a Star Destroyer that's upside down. The explanation for no reactor bulb or large hangar is because this Star Destroyer is not in fact an Imperial, but what's called a Tector class. This change was first made by Curtis Saxton in the Revenge of the Sith cross-section book, but has been confirmed by other sources in both Star Wars Legends and the new canon. Interestingly, and I'll have to admit I didn't know this before looking at the Wikipedia page for this ship, the Episode 6 novelization shows that it may have even been the intent of the filmmakers for the Falcon to be flying over a belly of the ship in this case. Either way, the lore for the Tector after this point was that it was essentially meant as an even more combat-focused version of the Imperial Star Destroyer. That's why there's that extra armor to help protect against vulnerabilities. The hangar is probably replaced with that additional reactor space, and generally the Tector
Tector would be more specialized for capital ship combat with the expense of certain new added vulnerabilities. You'd need to have the Tector protected by Corvettes or something because it has no fighter complement of its own. How practical is that for the Empire to build? Well, in my opinion, the Tector isn't really needed. The ISD was already outgunning almost anything else in space, and the Empire was losing a lot more ships to Starfighters than they were capital ships, so the Tector is a bit of a step in the wrong direction, in my opinion. Unsurprisingly, the Tector has always been a sort of oddity of Star Wars lore and hasn't really featured importantly in many or perhaps any stories. Interestingly, in Legends at least, the Tector wasn't the only non-Imperial class Star Destroyer which appeared at the Battle of Endor. We don't know much about the other two ships other than that they were called the Ithmar's Fist and the Pride of Tarlandia. But guys, as I said, this would be a short video and this is all I got for you today. What do you think of the Tector class Star Destroyer? Do you think upping an Imperial Star Destroyer to an even more ridiculous level makes sense? If so, how would you outfit the Tector besides for covering the hangar and making the reactor bulb more protected? How would you add to the general design? And on another note, what do you think of the idea of making this ship a Tector? Should they just leave it as an oddity of the movie? Do you think it's necessary to explain every little weird scene? Or are you just happy it's in there? Let me know all of that and more down in the comment section. Hey guys, this is Eckhart Slaughter. Hello and welcome to another video. Today we'll be covering the warships of the Sith. Not just one Sith Empire, the various Sith Empires which have existed throughout Star Wars history. Now, if you've been paying attention to the other videos I've put out during this sort of Sith week I've been doing on the channel, that's good, because we will be covering a lot of history and it does help provide some context. But even if you haven't, don't worry, I will try to explain everything that's going on here. Alright, so the true history of the Sith starts about 5,000 years before the Star Wars original trilogy with what was known as the Great Hyperspace War. Basically, the Sith and the Republic were sort of evolving independently. I've done an entire YouTube short which I'll link below on the origins of the Sith, so I'm not going to cover that in too much detail, but basically, Dark Jedi settled on Korriban, they took control of the Sith species there, and they created the Sith Order. Republic navigators accidentally stumbled upon Korriban, having discovered new hyperspace routes, and the Sith responded with an all-out invasion against the galaxy. The warships used by the Sith were largely alien to the Republic, and included most notably the Daraphin class battleship. However, there were other ship classes. The Essential Guide to Warfare refers generally to Sith frigates, and we do see in several images ships that look distinct. Unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot of information about them specifically. Because of how the Daraphin looks, it's my guess that some of these may have even been customized, but we also see that the Sith have a similar design language between their battleships and their troop carriers and other vessels. The Sith also had several ships they just called dreadnoughts. We hear about these most notably because of the Omen, which was a Sith dreadnought that crashed on the planet Kesh and led to the lost tribe of the Sith. There's also the very strange vessel known as the Sith Meditation Sphere. These weren't capital ships but were so important to battle that it's probably worth mentioning them briefly. Sith Meditation Spheres, as you might expect based on their name, allowed a Sith to amplify his or her dark side powers, especially when performing techniques like battle meditation. So you'd see Sith in their meditation spheres even at key battles. Anyway, the Sith did lose the Great Hyperspace War and were hunted nearly to extinction by the Jedi. The remaining Sith fled, and under the guidance of the Sith Emperor Vitiate and his Dark Council, rebuilt. But the rebuilding would take over 1,000 years. While the so-called true Sith were gone, the galaxy did see several Sith threats emerge, each of which used their own battleships. What's interesting though is that these Sith largely came from within the Republic and the Jedi Order, so they didn't have pre-built warships like we saw before the Great Hyperspace War or the Great Galactic War, which I'll talk about in a minute. During the Great Sith War, we see Exar Kun and his Brotherhood of the Sith, no, not the Sith Brotherhood, that's different, partner with the Mandalorians and the Krath to fight the Republic, so they largely used ships of those factions. Krath ships included the half-a-kilometer-long Supremacy class cruiser, as well as other similar-looking ships that you can see in images like this. Well, Mandalorian Crusaders offered a variety of strange technology, including most notably the Pyramid-type battleship. Following the Great Sith War was the Mandalorian Wars, and although the Sith were not active combatants during this conflict, it is important because we do see several capital ships emerge, which would then be used by various Sith factions. And if you're wondering, these are the ships that we actually see in the KOTOR video games. That's because Revan and Malak were both originally Jedi. They fought for the Republic during the Mandalorian Wars,
Then when they defected, they brought not only a ton of the Republic's military personnel with them, but also their ships. The first one of these was the Tector class cruiser, which a lot of people point out is one of the first Star Destroyer type ships in the Star Wars universe. You can see how this vessel in a lot of ways is cleaner in design than prior Sith ships, even though this was originally, again, a Republic vessel. There was also the less common but far larger and also still Star Destroyer-like Centurion class battlecruiser. One of these, the Ravager, was used by Darth Nihilus. So when you're talking about events that include Revan and Malak, including the Mandalorian Wars all the way until the Sith Civil War, generally that falls under the banner of the old Sith Wars. They ended about 4,000 years before BBY, and being proximate. Move forward another 300 years and you have the Great Galactic Civil War. For that conflict, the Sith group that I talked about earlier, the ones that escaped at the end of the Great Hyperspace War and rebuilt for over 1,000 years, returned to the galaxy, and this is where you see a lot of the ships from the Old Republic video game. And again, let's contrast this with the things we've just been talking about. These warships were actually built by the Sith for war. They weren't taken from another faction, or they weren't the ships of another allied faction. These were purpose-built Sith warships. The most famous example of these was the Harrower class. For its era, at 800 kilometers long, the Harrower was a large and powerful warship, and it was used by the Sith in the years preceding their invasion, then of course during the invasion itself. It came in several different variants and was produced in great numbers. The Sith did have some other smaller capital ships. One of the others, which is actually named, is the Terminus class, which was sort of an escort ship. These were really some of the main capital ships used by the Sith Empire during the Great Galactic War and subsequent conflicts. But that brings us to the new Sith Wars, which was basically 1,000 years of conflict between the Jedi and the Sith. Unsurprisingly, this war started out as Sith Wars usually do. Jedi defected from the Order, the first in this case being Darth Rune, and brought a bunch of his adherents with him, creating a new Sith Order. Unfortunately, while we do know some of the larger points of this conflict, a lot of the details are actually lost to us, and that includes warships. The only real warships of this era that I'm actually aware of are the ones mentioned in the Darth Bane trilogy, and the one mentioned is the Corsair battleship. Unfortunately, we don't get very much detail about that. There's also mentioned generally Sith dreadnoughts and Sith cruisers. After 1,000 years of the new Sith Wars, we have the Battle of Ruusan and eventually the Ruusan Reformations, and then 1,000 years of peace as the Sith worked quietly through the Rule of Two until, of course, we get to Emperor Palpatine. Arguably, any ship of the Empire was a Sith warship, so I'm not going to go over those. Obviously, the most famous one was the Imperial Star Destroyer itself. I think the Executor class Super Star Destroyer and the Eclipse class Super Star Destroyer are also particularly notable. Really, I think any ship of the Dark Empire is more Sith-y even than an Imperial ship. Then we have the ships used by Darth Krayt, and the one Sith, and arguably the Imperial vessels of that era as well, can be called Sith because usually the Sith used them. But that's it. Those are the warships of the Sith Empire throughout over 5,000 years of Star Wars history.
The hyperspace tunnel opened, and this black thing came crawling out from between the stars. We thought it was a ghost ship, until it opened fire. Hey guys, this is Eckhart's Letter. Hello, and welcome to another Star Wars video. Let's get right into things. The real nasty thing about the Empire and Star Wars Legends is that after the Battle of Endor, it didn't really go away. It just broke into many small parts. You'd be just done fighting one admiral, then an Imperial warlord would come out with a new Super Star Destroyer and cause you havoc. Or Han Solo would accidentally discover the Maw installation and we'd have new super weapons running around the galaxy. Stuff like that happened all the time. There were always new splinter groups with new fancy weapons to discover. However, sometimes even more troubling than that were cases of massive displays of power that could not directly be tied to a single warlord or Imperial Remnant faction. And that's the quote from above, which details how the New Republic encountered, for the first time actively at least, the Eclipse-class Super Star Destroyer. The ship, which was thought destroyed or unfinished, even by the best experts of the New Republic, was actually still in the hands of the Empire, and would soon spearhead a massive campaign against the galaxy. So we don't know where that quote came from or the exact context, but the Eclipse Super Star Destroyer actually has a lot of interesting backstory, and we'll talk about all of that, and then try to figure out what the Eclipse Eclipse was doing before Operation Shadow Hand. So, as a brief description, the Eclipse was basically the first of a new line of Super Star Destroyers, which would serve as the flagship of Emperor Palpatine when he was reborn about 6 years after his death at the Battle of Endor. The ship was absolutely massive, 17.5 kilometers long, slightly shorter than an Executor-class Superstar Destroyer, but far, far more massive. The Eclipse was armed with a dizzying array of weapons, including most famously an axial super laser, which could destroy almost any target with a single shot. Both the Eclipse 1 and the Eclipse 2 would be destroyed by the New Republic, with the latter also taking out the Galaxy Gun and the majority of Palpatine's secret fleet over the planet Biss. However, although the New Republic kind of acts otherwise, they shouldn't have been so surprised by the emergence of the Eclipse class, and they really had ample opportunity to prepare for such a massive warship. Well, maybe not ample opportunity, they were sort of tied up by Grand Admiral Thrawn, but they should have at the very least seen it coming. We know from, for example, the Imperial Handbook that Rebel intelligence knew of massive Super Star Destroyers like the Eclipse, which may have been under construction. Still, they were widely seen as rumors. However, in 4 ABY, shortly after the Battle of Endor, the New Republic and the Zon Consortium would attack the Kuat shipyards and find the partially constructed frame of the Eclipse-class SSD. The Zon Consortium would then infiltrate and take over the Eclipse using its super laser to blast enemy vessels, including the Super Star Destroyer Annihilator. The Zon Consortium would then run off with the Eclipse, plundering the ship's information databanks before eventually discarding it, knowing that they didn't have enough personnel to fully run it, and the fact that it would be far, far too large of a target, especially given its incomplete state. The Empire would manage to recover the ship and return it to Kuat. However, at this point, given the initial encounter and the use of New Republic intelligence, they definitely should have been aware of the vessel's existence and its partially complete state. Kuat, which was heavily fortified this time, continued work on the Eclipse. However, the vital shipyards would be attacked by the New Republic in 8 ABY, and the Eclipse would be used to ferry vital Imperial research scientists to the deep core. At this point, the Empire was losing massive territory across the galaxy, and their final strongholds were in the deep core and the Empire's most heavily guarded fortress worlds. One of these worlds was Biss, the Emperor's Citadel, where the Eclipse would stay for the rest of its life until seeing action. Palpatine was constructing many things at Biss, including the second Eclipse SSD, the World Devastators, and other state-of-the-art technologies. The Imperial scientists there used everything they had learned over the past decade to finish the Eclipse 1 and also further upgrade existing systems. As she became ready for service, Palpatine, even before Shadow Hand, largely took up residence on the Eclipse and began commanding Imperial forces. This is also another point where the New Republic probably screwed up. Although Biss was heavily fortified, we see in the Dark Empire comics that they were still somewhat open to trade. Some smuggler connected to the New Republic could have made a fortune just by giving away the existence of the Eclipse, which was said to be holding over the planet as a sort of reminder of Imperial authority. I think it's likely at this point that the Eclipse first started doing those attack runs against the New Republic. It would have been fully finished here, and the Empire probably would have wanted to test out their newest toy before Operation Shadow Hand. I don't think it was during the war itself, because it's just not really presented that way, and the New Republic doesn't even seem to know which ship attacked them. The only way we know the connection is because it's made explicit in the new Essential Guide to Vessels. Lucky for the New Republic, they managed to cut short Palpatine's dreams for a new generation of supermassive Star Destroyers with just the 2 Eclipse dreadnoughts. We know that he planned for the Sovereign class, which at 15 kilometers long was sort of a miniaturized Eclipse, but still almost infinitely powerful. But those 4 initial ships never actually finished construction. And that's another interesting note about the Eclipse. That ship was so expensive that it barely made it through its construction life without being plundered by somebody in the Empire. There were calls to take the Eclipse apart and use the material for Star Destroyers, to just abandon the process due to the extraordinary resource costs. However, most likely because of the presence and influence of Palpatine, that never happened.
The Yuuzhan Vong War saw the death of the New Republic and the birth of the Galactic Alliance, a government which attempted to unify the New Republic, the Empire, and other independent factions, including the Jedi Order. However, while long-lived, at least in post-Republic terms, by 170 years after the Battle of Yavin, the Empire had fully withdrawn from the Alliance and declared war. After siding with the Sith, and specifically the one true Sith led by Darth Krayt, the war turned in the Empire's favor and the Alliance was pushed into exile. However, a mere 3 years later, Darth Krayt attempted an assassination on Roan Fel and seized control of the Empire and the galaxy, both of which he heavily militarized. The Imperial fleet under his control would create the ultimate Star Destroyer, the Imperious. We'll talk about that ship today, but before we do, let's talk about its predecessor, the Pelion, and the Legacy era. So there were two major doctrinal shifts in naval strategy between the early Galactic Alliance era and the Legacy era. First, the military became less decentralized, with the Galactic Alliance itself providing most of the military force throughout the galaxy rather than individual systems. This is what I'd call an Imperial model compared to a Republic or a New Republic model. Second, there was a rejection of large capital ships, with a focus on specialization and efficiency rather than size. For that reason, although actually smaller than an Imperial Star Destroyer, arguably the most powerful warship in the galaxy, at least until its successor, was the Pelion Star Destroyer. The Pelion was intended to maintain the classic Imperial Star Destroyer design while making substantial design improvements, not unlike its namesake, Admiral Galad Pelion. The Pelion's hull was slanted forward, optimizing the ship for forward attacks, while also optimizing the firing arcs for individual guns. Because the guns could rotate freely, many were actually centralized on the ship's spine. However, for broadsides only, some were placed within the ship's brim, with secondary guns also dotting the entirety of the vessel. The Pelion also had a very small side profile, and thus was a deadly force when broadsiding an enemy. It could bring all of the firepower of an Imperial Star Destroyer to bear, but was harder to hit. On that note, the ship did have the standard elevated Star Destroyer bridge, but it was closer to the ship's body where it could be protected by its guns. Also, from a design standpoint, the front of the Pelion is also very similar to the Resurgent, although they exist in different continuities, in that both seem to have a variety of sensors and communication equipment near the front of the ship. Legacy era ships were so small, partially due to miniaturization of computer technology, but the Pelion itself was seen as a command ship, so extensive facilities would have been needed for communication, fleet coordination, and more. Although we don't know much more regarding hard numbers, as I said, the Pelion was smaller than a Star Destroyer, it probably had a comparable carrying capacity, and most likely actually outgunned an ISD due to differences in technology. It also had built-in interdiction capabilities, which is incredibly impressive, and large capital ships of the Legacy era also had much faster hyperdrives, with the Pelion rocking a 0.75. For these reasons, it's pretty clear why the ship was considered essentially a miniaturized SSD, meant especially for command duties and capable of destroying pretty much any enemy capital ship in a one-on-one battle. Pelions were commonly found anchoring major fleets across the galaxy and were produced in numbers. However, as the Legacy era campaign guide explains, though the Pelion was an appropriately effective command ship, Darth Krayt turned to the Mon Calamari to upgrade the design, and in traditional Mon Cal fashion, they made something already good even better. First of all, the new ship, which would be called the Imperious, boasted even better internal computer systems, while components of all types took up less space. On that note, despite being actually a little bit larger, crew requirements were massively decreased, in a trend seen almost 2 centuries earlier with the Republic's Katana fleet. Because internal components took up much less space, I'm also guessing that the ship had a more robust internal structure. The shielding systems were also upgraded, making the devastating ship even harder to kill. Weaponry seemed to be essentially the same based on the RPG numbers we get. However, the Imperious was also outfitted with gravity mine technology. The New Republic arguably pioneered this type of mobile gravity-based technology with both their usage of interdiction mines and HIMS generators, but gravity mines are a really interesting idea. A ship could layer the battlefield with these mines, which would prevent hyperspace retreat. Additionally, the Fel Empire had a variety which could attach to enemy ships. Gravity mines come with both some advantages and disadvantages. One of the main advantages is that the capital ship doesn't actually need to be present to interdict a location. For example, mines can be dropped off on a hyperspace route and can function without any sort of oversight. This tactic was used incredibly successfully by both the Vong and the New Republic during their war. Also, when it comes to ship-based interdictors, it is possible to either destroy the ship or just escape its range, something that's more difficult with mines. However, there are also disadvantages. At least during the New Republic era, it was not possible to disengage a gravity mine, so once they were laid, both forces were stuck for a predetermined period of time, so it's sort of an all-in on the battle. They're also impossible to move after being laid. That's assuming at least that by the Legacy era, no major technological improvements have been made. It's unclear whether the Imperious still had traditional interdiction technology, but I think it's very possible that those capabilities were neglected so more power could be shunted towards key systems. All in all though, the Imperious was unquestionably the most powerful ship of the Legacy era, and in my mind, with some small issues, pretty much the greatest that a Star Destroyer can be, at least in its role as a command ship. The first Imperious was produced at the Mon Calamari shipyards, but was stolen as construction was finished. The Mon Calamari, who aided the Alliance in this theft, were rewarded by having their world utterly devastated by the Sith and the majority of Mon Calamari and Quarren on the planet killed. The Imperious, renamed the Alliance, would then serve as the GA's flagship for the remainder of the war. And that takes us to the end of today's video. What do you think of the Imperious? Is it a worthy successor of the Pelion and the Imperial Star Destroyer? Do you prefer something like the Nebula or other New Republic/GA designs? Additionally too, and I'm just being honest, make this video a little bit longer, I'll answer a question from Noah Claridge. He asks, I was wondering, what about flying cars people used on Coruscant? I don't think they're all cloud cars, but what else could they be? That's a good question, and one you won't really understand unless you dig into the Star Wars EU. Star Wars has what's called repulsor lift vehicles. Basically, they operate on some sort of gravity manipulating system called repulsors. Typically, they don't actually fly in space. They're sort of what you'd call aircraft in the real world. Cloud cars would be another example of this, as would the Rebel Alliance's snow speeders. They're basically ships that can fly in atmosphere but not in space, and they use Star Wars' version of anti-grav technology. Repulsor lift vehicles were sometimes subject to jamming, harsh conditions like wind, or just general unreliability, so sometimes we also see vehicles like the Juggernaut, which use wheels, or AT-ATs or other walkers, which use legs instead. And it also seems like certain repulsors, like Luke's speeder, were generally limited in how high they could travel. Battle cruisers were rare within the Empire. They were more expensive than standard Imperial Star Destroyers, but lacked the overwhelming firepower or fear factor of dreadnoughts like the Executor. Still, I think if used effectively, battle cruisers can be great tools of war. An excellent example of this is the Allegiance class Heavy Star Destroyer. The Allegiance is what you'd get if you design the standard ISD while dropping all pretenses of making a balanced, multi-role ship. It is designed for one thing: smashing and destroying large enemy capital ships. Like the Tector, the Allegiance lacks the standard Star Destroyer ventral hangar, opting instead for more armor and greater power generation. This gives the ship an extra thickness, which is even more noticeable when we examine the dorsal superstructure, which is longer, wider, and more armored. Comparing the Allegiance to a standard destroyer clearly illustrates the difference. Capital ship grade weapons were also more numerous. We see 2 extra sets of main octuple turbo laser batteries on each side of the ship, and, interestingly, heavy trench and axial guns on a sort of swiveling mount, not unlike those seen on the Bellator. The Allegiance is a highly specialized ship, and can take on anything short of a Super Star Destroyer. However, to be effective, it will need fighter and small craft support. Given its numerous powerful weapons, it would be well suited to leading a few dedicated carriers and corvettes or frigates into battle. I complain about Star Destroyers a lot, but that's largely because the Empire used them as a catch-all capital ship. Besides for common issues like an overexposed bridge, I really have no problem with the Allegiance. And it even does some things better from a design standpoint than the standard ISD. It's a little bit more squat. Those gun batteries going up the spine of the ship would have an excellent firing arc, and it actually seems to have many guns of different size, giving it some versatility. But those are the design basics. Let's now look at history. The Heavy Star Destroyer first saw service during the Empire's heyday, though we have no records of action. It's my opinion that many of these ships, after their production, were hidden away in the deep core. As I alluded to at the beginning of the video, battlecruisers were in a weird spot. It was uncommon that practically the Empire would need anything larger than an ISD, especially when fighting the Rebellion or independent systems or pirate groups, and if anything larger was needed, dreadnoughts were typically called upon because of their wow factor. In other words, a single Super Star Destroyer could bring sectors in line just based on its presence alone, in a way a battlecruiser would not, while the firepower that a battlecruiser would bring could also be represented with a couple of Star Destroyers. So back to my theory, I think that instead of seeing action, battlecruisers were probably stored away in the deep core as a powerful reserve fleet, and in 10 ABY, several Allegiance Star Destroyers saw action within the fleets of Palpatine's Operation Shadow Hand. The Allegiance itself commanded the fleet that attacked Mon Cal early on in the war, though it was destroyed as a New Republic task force exited hyperspace and fired on the ship before it could raise its shields. Other allegiances are later seen escorting the Eclipse. Interestingly, Dark Empire refers to the Allegiance as a Super Star Destroyer. This confirms that it's not an ordinary ISD, but does make its size a bit murkier. By the way, I've discussed Dark Empire size discrepancies in a previous video. Nonetheless, it's unclear to me whether the Allegiance was only meant to be 2.2 kilometers or something larger. That being said, Dark Empire was released basically concurrently with Heir to the Empire, meaning that it was very early on in the revamped Star Wars expanded universe. So terms like Super Star Destroyer were often thrown around without a whole lot of meaning. The Allegiance's non-Dark Empire appearance and the 3D models I've been using throughout this video was created by artist Ansel Howe, aka Fractal Sponge. Like the Bellator, his Allegiance design was initially only a fan model, though it was included and thus canonized in the Essential Guide to Warfare, and personally, I think he does a phenomenal job of capturing the ship that initially appeared on the pages of Dark Empire. And specifically the Golan defense stations, which could commonly be seen defending planets in the Star Wars galaxy. So there are many prongs to a good planetary defense. Probably the most important one would be a planetary shield, and really a good shield can basically halt even the strongest attacking forces. If the planetary shield is up and if it's strong, the only real way you'll be able to beat it is through an extraordinarily prolonged orbital bombardment, which is not really practical, some sort of sabotage on the ground to destroy the shield generators, or a blockade which will cut off supplies to the world, which is especially effective if they're highly dependent on shipments from other planets. However, the planetary shield is only one aspect. We also have defense fleets, which were often at major planets or at least in the same system to respond to attacks. There were ground-based weapons like the ion cannon we see on Hoth, or the various turbo lasers that were stationed across the galaxy. And then of course we have space stations. Now, space stations came in many different varieties. Coruscant, for example, had everything from orbital yards to private skyhooks to giant mirrors which would direct the sun to the planet's surface, and weaponized defense platforms. Now, there were countless types of defensive space stations used in the galaxy, but I would argue that the most common was the Golan line. I would argue that the Golan was the primary space station used defensively by the Republic, by the Empire, and by the New Republic. And that's not really a surprise, because the New Republic inherited a lot of their space stations from the Empire. For example, when they took Coruscant, although they did have to assault some of the Golans directly, many of the stations actually remained operational and would serve in the defense of the planet for years to come, including against Grand Admiral Thrawn. But let's talk history, because the Golan line has seen several different revisions, with each one improving quite significantly on the prior version. Here's what we get from the FFG sourcebook Fly Casual. The Golan 1 space platform was a very large, heavily armored, and armed space platform, and the first of a series of planetary defense platforms built by Golan Arms. It continues and gives a bit of history, saying that the Golan was developed during the Clone Wars to help free up ships for the war effort. So basically, instead of having to park a few Venators over Coruscant, you build some Golan defense platforms. That being said, especially by the Galactic Civil War, they were sort of showing their age, especially
especially when it came to firepower, and a lot of this would have had to do with just the sheer degree of militarization after the drop of the Ruusan reformations. So the Golan 1 would have been relegated to backwater worlds or worlds that couldn't afford to upgrade, and it wasn't really able to take on large capital ships, but still could have taken on pirates or even some smaller cruisers. Golans, however, were not only present around planets, but also sat within hyperspace lanes, sort of as checkpoints. Aside from 14 port and starboard turbo lasers, 3 dorsal and 3 ventral torpedo launchers, and a series of tractor beam, the Golan 1 also held 2 squadrons of TIE fighters. The Golan 1 wasn't very prominent in the post-Endor period, at least as I said on important worlds. However, the Golan 2, which of course was next in line, was still active. We see, for example, in Heir to the Empire that, although Coruscant had upgraded to Golan 3s, important shipyards like the one at Bilbringi were still simply relying on Golan 2s. The last command sourcebook says specifically that the Golan 2 is meant for repelling starfighter and light capital combat starship assaults, and has not only been significantly upgunned and upsized from the original design, but also has more efficient power generators and thus greater shield power. It has in total 35 turbo laser batteries, 10 proton torpedo launchers, and a massive upgrade of 8 tractor beam emplacements. Additionally, even if the shield has been breached, it can absorb a lot of damage because of its compact and cross-beam design. The Starships of the Galaxy sourcebook gives a really good explanation for how the Golan class was developed and how the space stations were used across the galaxy. As we mentioned, the Golan 1 was developed during the days of the Republic and was very common. However, when the extra firepower was needed to face off against increasingly powerful ships, the Golan 2 was made, and it says by the Battle of Endor they were considered to be commonplace. However, this brings us to the next station in line, the Golan 3. Now, Golan 3s were extraordinarily powerful space stations, and as the last command sourcebook states, they were reserved for only the most important military installations in vital civilian worlds, which is why you see some at Coruscant, for example. The Golan 3's increase in strength was similar to the Golan 2's increase over the Golan 1. It was much larger, and it probably had larger power generators, giving it a stronger shield. It maintained the smart design of the Golan 2, which made it very sturdy, and it had even more guns, specifically 50 turbo laser batteries, 24 proton torpedo launchers, and now 15 tractor beam projectors, plus whatever amount of starfighters could fit on board. When Thrawn raided Coruscant, he attacked 2 of the planet's Golan defense platforms with a fairly sizable force, taking advantage of inexperienced command on the ground and forcing the New Republic to divert ships away to try to defend the platforms, despite the fact that, as Thrawn said, Golan defense platforms can take considerably more punishment than their former ground commander apparently realized. Thrawn used the words former commander because once General Bel Iblis assumed command of Coruscant's defenses, he pulled the fleet back and basically let the Golan 3s sort of slug it out with the Imperial fleets, and none of them were lost, at least as much as we know. Now, these were all Golans that the New Republic captured from the Empire, and Palpatine also had these stations installed at other key worlds, including Biss, which was basically his fortress planet, and arguably to him, the most important planet in the entire galaxy, which really speaks to the power of these stations. Golan 3s are often described as not much more powerful than Imperial Star Destroyers, but it seems like they are much sturdier. This makes them great for planetary defense duties because if you're on a planet that has a Golan platform, there's probably also a fleet in range and a shield and a ground-based cannon. So as long as the stations can survive long enough to hold off an attacker, they are really contributing overall to a planet's defense, if that makes sense. Golan 3s would continue to see use throughout the end of the Galactic Civil War, the Yuuzhan Vong War, and beyond. They were even used, for example, to contain the Death Seed, which was a really nasty disease that took a hold on Nom Chorios after the death of Palpatine. The Golan line would continue production, and by the Legacy era there was a Golan 8 space station, indicating that there had been several models, of course, since the Golan 3. One interesting thing about the Golan 8 was that it actually had a hyperdrive attached to the space station, which I think is really practical, and I guess they would just shut it off when not in use and route the power to the weapons and shielding. But we don't really know a lot about the actual weaponry, especially because the Legacy era campaign guide is kind of weird in how it displays weapon numbers. It also makes me wonder though, I guess other Golan platforms were just moved by like hyperspace tugs or something. I think it would have made sense to give them just a very small and very poor hyperdrive, maybe take
weeks or months to move across the galaxy, but you won't really be using these very flexibly like that. You're meant to drop a Golan in place and basically leave it there. Otherwise, you're just building capital ships. And that really, I think, is the main benefit over a capital ship. Though I think there are some strategic concerns in the other way. Presumably, Golan platforms are not geosynchronous. They would be pointing towards, I guess, any likely hyperspace vectors in towards the planet. Now, that can be guessed somewhat based on hyperspace routes, but if a planet can be attacked from two sides, well then one Golan is just going to be completely useless. But to be fair, that's also the case with starships. It's going to take a fleet a long time to actually move around a planet anyway. Golans with their accompanying starfighters and their tractor beams also work well, as we discuss, in a sort of checkpoint role, or working on borders, or in the middle of shipyards, basically anywhere that you need extra protection. And there are a few ships in the Alliance's navy which are basically in every single battle. Throw in a Nebulon B, a couple GR-75s, and some blockade runners, and you've got basically a Rebel Alliance task force. I always found that the CR-90 in particular was a very, very common vessel, and if you look at the lore, my gut feeling here is actually brought out. The new Essential Guide to Vehicles and Vessels says that the Corellian Corvettes became so strongly associated with the Alliance that many referred to them as Rebel blockade runners. While the West End Games Rebel Alliance sourcebook specifically says that the Corellian Corvette is actually the most common starship in the Rebel Alliance. So why are CR-90s so popular? Is it something like the X-Wing, where a large shipment of X-Wings made their way into Alliance hands, then they exclusively had the production details? Did they find a Katana Fleet-esque stash of these ships somewhere in the galaxy? No, that's not it at all, actually. The CR-90 was so popular in the Alliance because it uniquely served the Alliance's interests. There's a few things we'll talk about here. One is modularity, but before we get there, we've got to talk about the popularity of the CR-90 as a whole and the ship's innocuous nature. What do I mean by that? Well, Corellian Corvettes were very, very popular vessels in the galaxy, not only among the Rebel Alliance, but many different groups, from planetary militias to honest traders to pirates to anyone in between. Remember, the Tantive, or the Tantive, I guess, 4 was held up as a consular ship. The Alliance sourcebook does a great job of explaining why this is so useful to the Alliance, and I'll just quote directly. Because of the Corvette's widespread popularity in the private sector, it is extremely difficult for the Empire to identify Rebel ships among the many civilian vessels. Realizing the tactical advantage of such a situation, Mon Mothma and her staff have suggested that sector commands utilize the ubiquitous Corvettes as transportation for clandestine operations. Barring boarding action against every single Corvette encountered, it is difficult to imagine what kind of tactics the Empire will come up with to counter this. So admittedly, that description there talks more about how Corvettes would be used as transportation ships rather than warships. However, the Saga Edition for Starships of the Galaxy Guide explains that even heavily modified CR-90s, ones which have serious weapon emplacements, can still look like legal, ordinary Corvettes. And if modifications, even illegal ones, are made, it's still not even likely that a given CR-90 belongs to the Alliance. So it's basically a great way to operate out in the open, especially if you have a whole Alliance team working behind the scenes to help with security and keep your ship's documentation up to check and whatever else. Because CR-90s were so common, it also meant that they were relatively easy for the Alliance to acquire, and the Alliance sourcebook, in my opinion, also somewhat suggests that CEC, the Corellian Engineering Corporation, may have been somewhat complicit in how ships were getting in Alliance hands. Still, even if the ship was the cheapest and most popular vessel in the galaxy, it probably wouldn't have seen its very wide use in the Alliance Navy if it didn't fit Alliance naval doctrine, which, as we'll discuss, it did. Aside from using its sort of covert nature to launch sneak attacks or raids, Corellian Corvettes were useful to the Alliance because of their extreme modularity. The CR-90s can serve, and I quote from the new Essential Guide to Vehicles and Vessels, as a troop carrier, light escort vehicle, cargo transport, and even passenger liner. The original Corellian Corvette is still in wide use throughout the galaxy, a testament to its quality design and durability. As an example for modularity,
modularity, original Corellian Corvettes would not come with any weaponry. However, there were several weapon emplacements where guns could easily be added without really messing with the ship's structure. And you can actually fit a lot of guns onto the Corvette. Blockade runners could support as many as 8 turbo lasers, 6 laser cannons, and 4 ion cannons, while other components like shield generators could be easily upgraded. However, you could actually make even more extreme modifications to the CR-90. The Nightcaller from the Wraith Squadron trilogy is actually one of my favorite capital ships, and it was actually modified to carry TIE fighters, then later also Rebel Starfighters, not only in a hangar, but also mounted to the escape pods. We also have the Farstar, which again has a very large and very dramatic hangar, which was added after the ship left production. So the CR-90 is capable of supporting completely new additions to the ship and can easily have its turbo lasers or shield systems swapped out and replaced with better technology. Just to conclude this section, this is what the Sega Edition Starship of the Galaxy Guide says about the CR-90. The ease at which CR-90 Corvettes are modified makes adding weaponry, shielding, and even secondary hull plating a simple matter, meaning that aftermarket modifications that boost the ship's offensive capability are among the most common upgrades made to the vessel. Pirates, gun runners, ship jackers, and smugglers favor the CR-90 because even a heavily modified ship can appear innocuous at first glance, which is kind of what we mentioned earlier. Aside from modularity, the basic design of the CR-90 also worked well within the Rebel Alliance. The Corvettes were obviously extremely fast, and as their nicknames would suggest, were often used to run Imperial blockades, or just generally to escape from Imperial fleets. Alongside its weaponry, that means the CR-90 can be very effective against small ships, and various CR-90s coming together can even threaten larger assets like an Imperial Star Destroyer, although you would need quite a few Corvettes operating together very carefully to do something like that. Considering its size, and especially if upgraded, the CR-90 was also considered to be a very durable vessel, adding to its functionality. So just to summarize, the CR-90 was such a common Rebel ship because it was very common in the galaxy. It worked really well for the Rebel Alliance because it could sort of operate in plain sight. It was heavily modular, and just generally, the type of ship that the CR-90 was fit well into Rebel Alliance naval doctrines. One final thing about modularity too that I'll finish the video off with is the fact that because CR-90s can be modified, they are considered dynamic assets, and the ship can not only appear to be a civilian vessel, but if you need to, you can take the guns off the CR-90, move them somewhere else, and literally just use it to transport material or people. So, yesterday the gameplay trailer for Star Wars Squadrons dropped at the virtual EA Play. Now, I did do a breakdown of that on this channel, which you can find in the description, but I'd like to talk about it a little bit more. And one thing I'm sure many of you guys have noticed is the prominence of the MC-75 Mon Cal Cruiser, a ship which first appeared in Star Wars Rogue One, but which has somewhat been silent after its first appearance. So today we'll be talking about the MC-75s within the Rebel fleet after the Battle of Scarif, what happened to them, which ones still exist, and basically everything we know about the class's history. Before we get into things though, I will say if you want more Squadrons content, I've got a video up on the second channel today. It's very short, but it details all of the evidence suggesting that there might actually be more than 4 playable Starfighters in the upcoming game, so I'll link to that down in the description and also in the upper right hand corner. Anyway, let's get on with the content. So, like most Mon Calamari vessels in Star Wars canon, the MC-75 was formerly a city ship within the oceans of Mon Cala, which was repurposed for war in light of the Empire's tyranny. As of this point, the most famous MC-75 and the first one we saw on screen was the Profundity, which was Rhaenys' ship during the Battle of Scarif. The Profundity sadly was destroyed by Darth Vader, but not before facilitating the escape of the Death Star plans. Although the Profundity was destroyed, we know that other MC-75s participated in the Galactic Civil War, although up to now real concrete detail has been fairly sparse, mostly in the form of pictures without a whole lot of context. We got, for example, the what I would call quasi-canon Profundity expansion pack track for Star Wars Armada, which, as that game usually does, suggested that there could be different tactical loadouts for the Profundity, including an armored and an ordnance version. The Rebellion in the Rim expansion also features some really nice art actually of the MC-75 on the box, so even with just that, it's pretty safe to assume that the class had other ships besides just the Profundity and that they were active during the Galactic Civil War. We know from the Rogue One visual guide that one of the existing MC-75s was also called the Aspiration, which escaped Mon Calamari and joined the Rebel Alliance, although the fate of that ship is unknown. However, with the release of Star Wars Squadrons, we now have new information about the MC-75 class, coming as of now only on the Star Wars databank. So here's what we get about the Temperance, which is presumably the ship which appears in the trailer. The Temperance is an MC-75 cruiser built on Mon Cala. Alongside its sister ship Accordance, the Temperance defended the borders of the Hosnian system during the Battle of Endor, repulsing an Imperial armada that was attempting a surprise attack against the core worlds. The Accordance was lost in the battle, but the Temperance took on the survivors and carried the day. It currently serves as Vanguard Squadron's flagship, with Vanguard Squadron being the New Republic squad that you'll play as in Star Wars Squadrons. So basically, two MC-75s, the Temperance and the Accordance, protected the Hosnian system during the Galactic Civil War and specifically the Battle of Endor. I actually find this a little weird because I wouldn't expect the rebels to physically be holding territory they would need to protect at this point, especially not in the core worlds like the Hosnian system. That's basically just asking to get absolutely overrun by the Empire. But apparently the Rebel Alliance had a presence there and these two ships fought some sort of battle against an Imperial fleet. And that's it. We'll learn the fate of the Temperance presumably by the end of the Star Wars Squadrons campaign. But we actually do know that MC-75s, at least in some respect, were used by the New Republic, or at least by systems in that era, because at the Battle of Exegol, we see a ton of not only MC-75s, but MC-75 variants, the basic ship with slightly different adjustments or configurations. I've done a whole video if you're interested in all the weird sort of Mon Calamari variants that are actually at the Battle of Exegol, but if you pay attention, the MC-75 is very, very prominent. If you've only just watched the Clone Wars, or even read some of the mainline Star Wars comics or books set in that time frame, you might very reasonably believe that the Republic and the CIS basically only used Vanators and Providences in the ships that we commonly see on screen. However, there is substantial lore detailing the use of other Republic and Separatist capital ships. Today, we'll be examining that lore in detail and looking specifically at some of the largest vessels that you might not know exist. Now, some you might, and that will be the case with the first batch of ships, which I'll call early Imperial vessels. And yes, towards the end of the Clone Wars, the Republic actually made use of ships which would much more commonly be associated with the Empire. Even the Imperial-class Star Destroyer actually debuted under a Republic insignia, although at that time it was called the Imperator. The Imperial One would basically just be the Imperator, and we also see the Republic use the Tector, which is an Imperial Star Destroyer without hangar space, but with additional armor and weaponry. The same goes for the Victory and a ton of smaller ships that don't really warrant discussion in today's video. However, we can actually move up from the Star Destroyer class of vessels and look at larger ships which saw service in the Imperial Navy and did so in the Republic Navy. However, instead of looking at Imperial designs that debuted during the Clone Wars, we'll actually be looking at pre-Clone Wars designs which turned out to be so popular that they were adopted in one form or another under the Empire. And obviously this is a fairly limited class of ships, given the fact that we're talking about vessels that were extremely powerful but designed before the Clone Wars, i.e. in a Ruusan Reformation era. But as I've discussed, we did see Kuat drive yards during this time, making some really powerful ships. On the smaller side, we have something like the Procurator battlecruiser. Although there's been no official art, I think Fractal Sponge does a good job of capturing the ship as it's described, and the Procurator was a 2.5 kilometer long battlecruiser that mostly served as an advertising piece within the Kuat defense fleet. It's unclear exactly how these were used, but they would have been fairly old during the time of the Clone Wars, so it's very likely that they were retrofitted, and because of their power and size,
would have been limited to defending key planets like those in the core. However, the Procurator has more interesting cousins, I'd guess, and I'm talking specifically about the later designed Praetor class battlecruiser and the Mandator Dreadnought. So both of these ship types were designed before the Clone Wars, but when war broke out, they received significant upgrades. Praetors sometimes were used to lead Republic battle groups, which sort of matches how we'd see the Empire later use the Praetor too. However, I think the more notable vessel of this era would be the Mandator class Dreadnought. The Mandator was 8 kilometers long, and before the start of the Clone Wars would have probably been the most powerful ship of its time. Although because of this power and the rules against warship construction at that time, it would have had a very limited, if not non-existent hyperdrive, basically limiting it to the Kuwati sector. The Clone Wars saw not only several Mandator 1s updated for service, but also the new Mandator 2, which was more heavily armed, armored, and of course had a better hyperdrive installed without needing to be upgraded. The Mandator 2 probably was still the most powerful warship of this era, and I think even with the ion weapon powered, it could probably stand up to a subjugator class heavy cruiser. Probably the least well-known ship of this era would be the Maelstrom class battlecruiser, and when I searched on YouTube, all I could find about this ship was a video that I did and a very cool recreation of my design for the Maelstrom, which was made in Space Engineers by a user called Lone Rebel 06, and I'll link to that down below. So the Maelstrom appears only in an FFG RPG source guide, so not only is it of very low canon status, but it doesn't even have an associated image, which is why Lone Rebel's design is based on my admittedly pretty crappy drawing. But as a battlecruiser, obviously would have been very large. It's supposed to have been very expensive to run, but one also did see some service within the Rebel Alliance, which is pretty wild. I'm hoping future FFG content, whether Legends or canon, somehow fleshes out this ship, because I think the idea of another battlecruiser for the Republic is pretty cool, especially one without the sort of pre-war design history. And I think that would be the case with the Maelstrom because it's sort of described somewhat like a Venator. It's got these double command towers, and I don't know, it would just be cool to learn more, even if we don't see it in any major content. The last thing I'll mention is that the Republic would have also used a bunch of older pre-war vessels like the Invincible class, and I think that's more in the ballpark of Corey Loses, and I'll link to both his gaming channel where you can see him play as some of those ships in his mod Fall of the Republic for Star Wars Empire at War, and also his lore channel because I think he'll probably cover some of them in the future. Also, the New Republic's navy would have been supplemented by many private system fleets, basically planets that raised their own defenses. It's very possible that some of these had very large ships, albeit with Rus on limits. I think that'd be a cool topic for another video, by the way, but really here your imagination is the only thing limiting you. Let's now move to the CIS, and the first ship I want to look at is the Subjugator class heavy cruiser. And I know what most of you are saying, we all saw the episode of the Clone Wars featuring the Malevolence, the Separatist superweapon, and a Subjugator class heavy cruiser. And while that is true, the Malevolence was not the only Subjugator. The Malevolence had at least one sister ship and possibly a few more, and they all seem to have the same ion weapons, although perhaps with different configurations, which I think is interesting. Staying on the topic of little details about well understood ships, some people also don't recognize that both the Providence and the Recusant, both mainline CIS capital ships, had both standard and large size variants. We see the large Recusant, for example, quite clearly during the Clone Wars. While an ordinary Recusant is less than 1200 meters long, we can see that the Dreadnought variant, which sits at 2.5 kilometers plus, is vastly larger than a Venator class Star Destroyer. We also have the Bulwark line, and I've covered one of these ships specifically in a dedicated video. There is some confusion because there's technically 3 Bulwark types. I don't think it's really clear which ones would have been around during the Clone Wars, so I'll just refer you guys to that video. However, the Bulwark ranged from either 1 kilometers in the Bulwark Mark 1 to 2.5 with the Bulwark 3, and basically served as a hammer against the Republic, with actually a fleet of these causing serious damage. And with that, I think I've covered all of my bases here. I hope you guys learned some interesting information about the unseen giants fighting behind the scenes in the Clone Wars. I think it would be really cool if Star Wars Legends had more openly embraced some of this stuff, but part of it comes from the fact that many of the ships were creations of the Essential Guide to Warfare or RPG guides, and I guess authors just didn't have time to do so because of the late release of the Essential Guide to Warfare, or prefer to stick with more commonly well-known ships. So, as some of you may know, I run a podcast every 2 weeks with my friend Corey. It's called Tapcaf Transmissions. It's sort of a Star Wars Legends book club, and for this upcoming episode on Thursday, we are reading one of, if not the longest Star Wars books, I, Jedi. And there's actually a lot I want to cover in that book. It's really interesting. A lot we'll discuss in the podcast, but there's also a lot of little information that I can build videos around. And I, Jedi is interesting because it's sort of a retelling of the Jedi Academy trilogy, but from a new character, or at least one who doesn't appear in that trilogy, Corran Horn. It's also pretty unique as it's the only Star Wars book, at least full novel, that's written from a first-person perspective, hence the name I, Jedi. And for those of you who don't know what that means, basically instead of the author writing Corran walked around the corner, it would say I walked around the corner. Everything is from the internal perspective of Corran Horn. So quite interesting, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later. However, Michael Stackpole, as he often does, opens the book up with some Starfighter action. The New Republic is hunting a pirate group called the Invids, led by former Imperial Leona Tavira. The New Republic learned that the Invids were probably going to launch a raid on the planet of Alcatha, and Rogue Squadron waited out in an asteroid belt. From there, they were able to witness the Invid attack, which was much smaller than anticipated but still included a bulk freighter and 18 starfighters. These were ugly starfighters, and for those who don't know, uglies are basically fighters that have been built by putting together various ship parts and creating what is usually an abomination. Uglies typically aren't very effective, especially when they use TIE fighter parts, which are quite common but generally not very effective. However, uniquely for the Clutch, in my opinion, it's not only better than the basic TIE, but also just generally more well designed. The Clutch doesn't only have more weaponry and shielding, but also little adjustments, like allowing the pilot to have a better field of view from the cockpit. So let's talk about the basics of the ship. And the Clutch is sometimes called a tri-fighter because unlike the TIE, it has 3 wings. I'll read out an excerpt from I, Jedi. The Invids used a form of custom-designed fighter called a tri-fighter. It started with a ball cockpit and ion engine assembly of a Sienar Systems basic TIE fighter, a commodity which, after hydrogen and stupidity, was the most plentiful in the galaxy, and married it to a trio of angular blades set 120 degrees apart. The bottom 2 served as landing gear, while the third came up over the top of the cockpit. The fighter still had the TIE's twin lasers mounted beneath the cockpit, while the third TIE sprouted an ion cannon. The ships also had some basic shields, which explained why they were more successful than your basic eyeball, and side viewports cut into the hull gave the pilot more visibility. Because the trio of TIEs looked as if they were grasping at the cockpit, we named the design Clutch. So this is really an interesting ship. Typically uglies are made with whatever's lying around, so you kind of have Frankenstein monster ships, which aren't necessarily pre-planned but sort of made out of convenience. However, with the Clutch, it almost seems like this was a concerted effort to improve a starfighter, which they may have even had intact. One thing that I think is notable is that the Clutch isn't improved seemingly with surplus pieces of other vehicles, rather it might use prefabricated wings. The Invids used these ships pretty extensively. They had several squadrons made up of just tri-fighters. Some were even further modified with inclusions like onboard hyperdrives. Corran, when going undercover, is actually pretty generous in his assessment of the vehicle. The tri-fighter, when compared to an X-Wing, really didn't come off that badly. Sensor range seemed a bit light, but without proton torpedoes or concussion missiles, the need to hit at extreme range vanished. The ship's rolls were a bit sluggish, but the climb rate was good and dive rate was impressive. Above all though, the craft's agility impressed me. The rubber response allowed for quick shifts in which way the bow pointed. More importantly, the throttle and repulsor lift levers functioned in multiple ways. Then there's some more detail there, which basically explains how the tri-fighter can do extremely quick stops and turns, while also using X-Wing style control control pedals, which TIE fighters wouldn't generally have had. So generally the Tri-Fighter was a pretty good ship. It held up well in dogfights, and its shield and ion cannons gave it not only more survivability, but a better chance of damaging rebel ships or shielded starfighters generally. Obviously, the Clutch has some similarities to other pre-existing ships, including from the TIE line, the Phantom, and the Defender, especially really the Defender because it does have that ion cannon, but I think visually it probably looks quite similar to the Phantom, and also of course the CIS Tri-Fighter, which is, by the way, unrelated. There were still some issues. There wasn't an onboard life support, just like on standard issue TIEs, and I'm sure the loss of solar panels, especially when combined with added shielding and extra energy requirements, probably means that Tris have an even shorter operational life, but that's just guessing from my point. Today we'll be talking about my favorite of the Star Wars prequels and one of my favorite Star Wars movies ever, Revenge of the Sith. The prequels themselves are quite dense with visual information. There's a lot of CG, there's a lot going on, there's a lot of cool visual effects, and in Revenge of the Sith especially, there are a lot of hidden background spaceships and land vehicles. I say Revenge of the Sith specifically because it seems like, as we'll see in this video, that ship designs that didn't find a place in the other movies, especially if they were fully rendered, actually were thrown into the background of Episode 3, which makes sense. If you've got something, you might as well use it. The Order 66 scene, for example, has almost as many new vehicles and vessels as the entire Star Wars sequel trilogy, and I'm not trying to rip on the sequels, but it's just absurd the amount of detail thrown into these very short shots. So today we'll be looking at vehicles and vessels that are in the background that you might not have noticed before, and I'm curious, down in the comments, if there is something you'd never seen before today's video, please let me know. But let's get started with the High Altitude Entry Transport 221. I'll just call it the Republic Speeder, and this is one that I think is most easily spottable. You can see at least the rear of it very clearly during an Utapau scene, but that's basically the only place where it shows up. The Republic Speeder is a pretty cool design, and went through a pretty long design history. Here's what the Star Wars databank said about the ship. The Republic Assault Gunboat was first developed as a massive capital ship, 1,800 meters long, to be used by the Confederacy during the opening space battle. It then switched sides to the Republic, becoming known as the GGA Support Ship or the Good Guy A Support Ship. It then switched back again to the CIS before switching allegiances one last time, being scaled down, repainted, and modified to become speeder-sized and serving as a clone vehicle on Utapau. So this ship was likely replaced by the Providence, but because George or somebody on the team liked the design so much, it made its way into the film as a much smaller speeder. So as that same databank article explains, basically the gunboat was dropped in from atmosphere as a sort of drop ship. Then once within the atmosphere, it could not leave the planet but could travel very quickly on repulsor lifts. It was used for reconnaissance and light anti-vehicle and anti-personnel action. Personally, I'm kind of surprised that this never made its way into the Clone Wars TV show, just because it is such a cool design, and I can imagine some cool scenarios where this thing is dropped from orbit, heavily under fire, with perhaps some precious cargo. Anyway, let's move on to some more obscure ships, but stay on the planet Utapau. And these next couple of entries really illustrate how difficult of a job I have here. There's so much interesting background detail that I really can't cover everything. And when Obi-Wan flies into Utapau, for example, we can see a couple of parked ships, which I'm not personally able to identify. They're not anything that I'm about to talk about. They're not Grievous's personal starfighter. If you know what these fighters are, please let me know on Twitter. Anyway, when Obi-Wan's starfighter is leaving Utapau and Obi-Wan is hiding to go attack General Grievous, we get a close-up shot of a Porax 38. This was a starfighter belonging to the Utapauan Navy, but you might also recognize it as the Magna Guard fighter, and that's because that ship is based off the P-38 with some modifications. For the role it has in the movie, the P-38 is quite highly detailed and modeled for the half-second screen time it gets, so it was almost certainly meant to play a more prominent role in the film, perhaps as a cousin to the Vulture droid, or maybe as one of General Grievous's ship designs. In that sequence, we can also see another named ship, the Mank Vim 814 Light Interceptor. This seems to be another vessel produced by Utapau. Again, not really available in a lot of detail, but we can see 4 or 5 of them flying by during the meeting. Again, it's one of those blink it and you'll miss it things. Probably the best view you can get of the ship is right as Obi-Wan's landing. As of right now, I think the highest quality version of Revenge of the Sith is actually available on Disney+, and there are other background ships that you can see, but to my knowledge at least, none of them have been explicitly mentioned. And if I looked at every single one, we'd be here all day on just the Coruscant scenes. But this brings me to a side point. I think this is one thing that shows like the Clone Wars, or really any Clone Wars content, kind of missed out on, with some exceptions. Even though the war is across the galaxy, we don't really see a whole lot of ship and vehicle variety. It's always Republic ships versus CIS ships, or tanks, or whatever else. This is despite the fact that the movies, from episode 1 to episode 3, all show different defenses depending on the planet. And we know from the lore that before the Clone Wars, planets were basically responsible for their own security, so it makes sense that we'd see a lot of different vehicle varieties. We do get some of that with, say, the Umbarans, but it should have been even more prominent in my opinion. But let's move on to the Order 66 scene, and probably the funniest vehicle included here comes during the Felucia battle. Now, I was talking about this the other day because I think there was an issue with the modeling here with the AT-AP just being really huge. There may be a cliff here, but if you look at the size of the clone troopers, the AT-AP is much larger than it probably should be. Anyway, most people notice this, but the Republic does have a unique walker here, the AT-OT, the all-terrain open transport. A pretty dumb idea for a walker in my opinion. Put a top over it. I don't think there's really much benefit for it being completely open like that, but we don't really see this vehicle anywhere else. However, much harder to spot is the small speeder near the legs of the walker, which is called technically the infantry support platform, but most people know it as the swamp speeder. I say most people know it as the swamp speeder because it appears pretty prominently in Star Wars Empire at War, which by the way, I stream like 3 or 4 times a week on my second channel, but you can also see the swamp speeders during the Battle of Kashyyyk. You just really gotta pay attention because they're quite small and they move much faster than the juggernauts, which are pretty cool looking and kind of distracting. We'll come back to Kashyyyk in just a second, but I just want to point out that on Felucia, we also see some clone troopers riding some native wildlife, which I suppose counts. And I never realized this, but before Aayla Secura dies, you can actually see her standing down a CIS brigade, which is pretty cool. Anyway, back to Kashyyyk. The CIS use a previously established vehicle, the droid platoon. The platoon actually appeared all the way back in episode 1. It's sort of a unarmored MTT, but besides for that movie and episode 3, you don't really see it elsewhere. It's a pretty cool idea though. I like the idea that battle droids are super compact, and that's one of their biggest features. But yeah, besides for on Naboo and Kashyyyk, you don't see this vehicle very often. For our last vehicle, we'll stick with the Order 66 sequence and just point out probably the most obvious entry on this list, besides for the AT-OT I guess, the Republic Trident. I love the design of the Trident, or the UT-AT as it's more formally known. I love the design because it's almost like a battering ram or a bulldozer. It has extremely heavy front-facing weapons, and I imagine you could send that in first and then put your troops in behind it. We do see one blown up fairly easily, so I guess that does kind of take away from my theory there. But still, park this thing on a bridge or in a choke point and I really think you could do some serious damage. However, like most of the other entries on this list, despite the compelling design, the Republic Trident didn't appear in anything substantial besides for Revenge of the Sith, which I personally think is a real shame. Anyway, that's it for vehicles and vessels. I will note though, for one final last minute entry, that there is also a much smaller version of the Octuptar Tri-Droid that you can see during the assault on Utapau. I thought that was pretty cool. Legends distinguish the two by calling one a Magna Tri-Droid and the smaller one a Combat Tri-Droid. Hey guys, this is Eckhart Slaughter. Hello and welcome to another video. And today we'll be continuing the recent trend on this channel of covering hard to spot details from the Star Wars movies. Today, however, we'll be moving to Star Wars Episode 2. And I actually intended to do a whole video on sort of hidden ships in Episode 2 like I did for Episode 3, but I found there just wasn't really enough to warrant that. So instead I want to focus on one ship in particular, and that is the Diamond Claw class cruiser, which actually appears at the Battle of Geonosis. And you might be saying, well, I didn't spot anything at the Battle of Geonosis, at least capital ship wise, other than some Lucre hulks and some of those hard cell transports. And that's because the diamond is very, very difficult to spot. When I was rewatching it today, I only saw it during the battle once, just briefly at a scene in the very background. This is kind of weird because we actually do get some overhead shots of the battle and even some tactical maps, but we don't see the diamond class cruiser there, but whatever. Regardless, it definitely is there. It's a unique ship, and it was probably intended at one point to be more numerous on the battle, but I just think really, visually it's not very distinctive or very interesting to look at, which is probably why it's limited to just appearing in one spot. The best information about the ship comes in issue 116 of Star Wars Fact File, where it's called the Commerce Guild Cruiser. I'll read a brief excerpt from the article that discusses it because I think it gives a really good introduction to the ship. The Commerce Guild Cruiser was the guild's contribution to the starship fleets of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, which was the official title for the otherwise eclectic mix of separatist groups during the Clone Wars. Although the word cruiser usually denotes a fast and well-armed ship, the Commerce Guild vessels were only lightly armed for defensive purposes. Rather than being used for direct raiding or starship combat, they were more like weapon delivery systems and transports. Like many of the Confederacy ships, the Commerce Guild cruisers had been built with trade in mind, but was easily converted for use in the war. So, sort of like the Lucre Hulk, the Commerce Guild destroyer, or the Diamond, was essentially a transport pre-war, but was refitted for direct combat. Unlike something like the hard cell transports or the Lucre Hulk, the Diamond was made for very, very quick delivery and takeoff. So generally in combat, if this were in a fleet, you'd probably keep it in the middle and have it very protected. Otherwise, you could use the Diamond for some light anti-starfighter duties. However, what's really interesting about the ship is how it works with other Commerce Guild products, especially their line of spider droids. In battle, and this is even in space, the Diamond would sometimes launch thousands of droids, which would then attack en masse, sometimes even making their way inside of the ship and attacking as a sort of on-the-fly boarding team. And the droids are really its main offensive weapon, which is certainly unique for a Star Wars capital ship. It also seems like rather than just simply launching the droids, that sometimes they would fire at an enemy from on board the ship itself, which sort of reminds me of how Anakin used the SPHA in Legends as sort of an onboard heavy weapon for the Venator. That being said, in a conventional battle, these things weren't the best. They were very fast, they were pretty well armored, but just generally, they could be beaten by most Republic capital ships. However, where you really do not want to see the Diamond is on the battlefield itself, on the ground, because if that thing is approaching a landing zone, it probably means that you're about to get very, very close to literally thousands of spider droids. The Diamond was also very small at 120 meters long, so it's pretty clear where the ship was meant to fit into the CIS arsenal. And I think it is very helpful to have a variety of transport and landing vessels, considering the separatist use of Lucre Hulks, Trade Federation landers, hard cells, and more. And that is what happens when you make a group of corporations who are essentially retooling pre-war vessels. There will definitely be some crossover, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. The CIS also made the Recusant class, which is of course the long spindly ship you can see at the Battle of Coruscant. Speaking at the Battle of Coruscant, one thing that's really interesting about the Diamond is you can actually see one of those ships in the Star Tours ride for the Battle of Coruscant. Now, as some of you guys pointed out when I discussed this earlier, this Battle of Coruscant is perhaps a different one than the one at the end of the Clone Wars. It's perhaps with the Rebels versus the Empire, I guess. However, with that being said, it was very clearly at least designed to be the battle from Episode 3, and I find it interesting that the Diamond itself actually features. The model is actually really high quality as well, so I wonder if at one point ILM intended that ship to participate. It makes sense given the fact that they had already worked on the model since Episode 2. As I said, there's not really a whole lot else with Attack of the Clones that I want to bring up in this video. I will, however,
however, mention that we can see an action transport. That is a very famous ship type from the expanded universe. Talon Card's ship, the Wild Card, was an action transport, and you can actually see it in the Battle of Kamino from The Force Unleashed 2 and Star Wars X-Wing Alliance, both with real visual models. So it's very cool that the ship made its way into a mainline Star Wars film after being established even visually in the expanded universe. The X-Wing, TIE Fighter, and Millennium Falcon also all feature as Easter eggs in the movie, but I don't really count those ones. Anyway, I know this is a short video, but that's basically all I wanted to talk about. I will, however, answer a hashtag AskEck question. Today's question is, what mods do you use for Empire at War? I just downloaded it and I wanted to try it out your way. So there are a few mods that I really highly recommend. Chiefly among them is two mods made by my friend Corey. The first is Thrawn's Revenge, which is a post-Endor mod for Star Wars Empire at War. Basically, you can play all the way up from the days right after Endor to past the Thrawn campaign, past the Reborn Emperor, all the way up until the Yuuzhan Vong War. The war is not in yet, but the Yuuzhan Vong and the conflict will be later on, so that's very cool. However, if you more prefer the Clone Wars, then he also has a Clone Wars mod called Fall of the Republic. They both go under the Empire at War Expanded header, and you can find them on Steam. Otherwise, I do also quite enjoy Awakening of the Rebellion, which is a Galactic Civil War mod with some interesting gameplay changes. Today, I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at the history and different types of capital ship weapons in the Star Wars universe. And this is really a topic that's kind of under-discussed, because for most of the 4,000 or 5,000 years that dominated Star Wars Legends continuity, we really only see a handful of weapon types. Large turbo lasers for taking on other capital ships, smaller laser cannons typically, or blasters for targeting starfighters, then things like ion cannons, missiles, torpedoes, etc. So today we'll look at what came before and even after that. We'll also examining the general history of weapons development on a capital ship scale in the Star Wars Legends continuity. So let's get started. So because the name is super misleading, most people think that turbo lasers are actually laser-based weapons, and that's not the case. A laser in the real world is basically focused light. Well, that's clearly not the case with turbo lasers and laser cannons in the Star Wars universe. Both of those technologies are generally based off blasters, like handheld weapons, created usually by Tabana gas and some sort of power source. So definitely not just amplified light like we'd understand a laser to be in the real world. However, the reason for the name can actually probably be understood through this examination of capital ship weapon types. And originally, capital ships did use actual lasers as we would understand them in the real world. The Essential Guide to Warfare actually says that the first capital ships used microwave lasers for offense, so it's probably just the case that as the weapons technically changed, the names nonetheless stuck. Alongside microwave lasers, early capital ships also used more standard weapons like torpedo launchers and guided missiles. However, where a weapon is designed, defenses will sprout up to counter it, and the evolution of capital ship weaponry can largely be traced to both natural defenses and the increasing capabilities of other capital ships. When talking about natural defenses, we have the fact that because of the thick atmosphere present on most planets, light-based weapons just couldn't do very much damage against ground targets, so things like orbital bombardments just weren't possible. This changed about 10,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, as the Kumari Empire started using battleships which employed mass driver cannons. This certainly isn't a novel science fiction idea, and essentially they would fire large projectiles at extremely fast speeds. Now, capital ships could not only bombard planets traditionally, but could also bypass a common defensive measure present on other large ships, which was reflective armor plating. In response, important planets across the galaxy began developing their own anti-capital ship weaponry, including the first large-scale turbo lasers and also particle cannons. Now, these wouldn't be immediately employed on capital ships just just because of the much greater space, resources, and potential to generate energy on the ground, but all of that science would have eventually helped forward starship weaponry as well. It seems like mass drivers weren't the main weapon on capital ships for very long, even though the Republic and most likely other factions did incorporate the Kumari design, and by 8,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, and perhaps much earlier, the Republic was back to energy weapons. In 7800 BBY, the Republic fought a war against the Wayman Sea Storm. This conflict specifically helped the Republic further their energy weapons, largely due to increases in the efficiency of power generators, and at this point, common capital ship defenses against energy weapons, which at this point had moved to ray shielding, became much less effective. For a while, big turbo lasers became much more effective against everything else on the battlefield, and it was difficult for capital ships to protect themselves. In response, starfighters and very small capital ships had a bit of a golden age, and that most likely led to the development and furtherance of laser cannon technology. Now, the main difference between a turbo laser and a laser cannon is essentially scale, with laser cannons usually being smaller, less powerful, and more mobile. So if you want a comparison, Han and Luke in A New Hope used laser cannons to fight off the TIE fighters. The Death Star, on the other hand, had large turbo lasers on its surface for defense. And the distinction there is why a starfighter attack on the Death Star is much more feasible than a large capital ship attack. However, that general evolutionary period is from some assumptions made by me. Unfortunately, turbo lasers are really the focus of many of these source books which detail the history of warfare, including especially the Essential Guide to Warfare, and we do know a little bit less about the evolution, at least, of other weapon types. But we know, for example, that ion cannons, which I haven't mentioned yet, are described as ancient, and themselves may have come from some other type of electromagnetic weapon. It is very possible that the Great Droid Revolt of 4,015 years before the Battle of Yavin helped further not only handheld ion cannon weaponry, but also ship-based as well. Otherwise, we know that ion cannons, like turbo lasers, probably benefited quite significantly from technology generated as they were integrated into planetary defensive systems. That being said, some of these technologies would have been very old, and Zim the Despot, who existed 25,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, not only employed the defensive mirrored hulls, which I mentioned earlier, but also pulse cannons alongside what we would expect, including concussion missiles and torpedoes. My point in explaining this is just to show that most basics of modern weapon systems existed for a very long time in the Star Wars universe. Tens of thousands of years when talking about missiles and ion cannons, a little bit less when talking about turbo lasers. The reason why those in particular became popular among some of the other varieties that we've discussed, like mass driver weapons, microwave lasers, radiation-based weapons, and more, is basically because of what was available for defense and what was most benefited by technological increases in power generation especially. However, even in the modern Star Wars era, we do still see unique or divergent weapon types. On a smaller scale, we can look at, for example, the Hapens. The Hapens still use turbo lasers and ion cannons, however, their technology lagged behind in certain areas, specifically weapon firing speed. So Hapen battle dragons would generally have a sort of saucer that would spin, bringing fresh weapons to bear. More dramatically, we have something like a Mazer, which was a Chiss weapon, which was distinct from turbo lasers or blasters. It's not really clear how they're different than lasers, but they are at least somehow. The modern galaxy also saw the upscaling of major capital ship weapons, for example super lasers on ships like the Eclipse, or ion weapons on the Malevolence, and again that can largely be traced just to upscaled technology and better power generation. Because of the prevalence of particle shielding, mass drivers and other weapons would remain a distant second option on a ship's arsenal, except in the case of missiles and torpedoes. However, flak cannons, for example, were still sometimes used, although primarily defensively.